Hey there. Tonight we're drifting into a night colder than anything your blankets have ever known. Cold enough that the rigging above groans like it's in pain. Cold enough that a man's breath turns to frost before it even leaves his lips. You're standing on the deck of a weathered trading cog, somewhere in the frozen waters north of the old Hanseatic ports, sometime in the depths of the 14th century. The timbers beneath your boots are silvered with ice. The sea around you has gone the color of hammered pewter, flat and still in that eerie way water only gets when the cold has finally beaten the wind into submission. But before we let the story carry you off, take a slow breath. If this kind of quiet, wandering history helps you drift off at night, consider subscribing. Only if it genuinely helps you sleep, of course. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're tucked in tonight and what time it is where you are. Some of you are just getting home from work. Some of you are already halfway to dreaming. Either way, welcome. Now let the lantern light dim and let's step aboard. You move slowly across the frozen planks, careful of your footing. Each step lets out a small crackling sound, like walking over a shallow pond that hasn't quite made up its mind to freeze solid. It's the deep hour of the night, the one that has no real name, too late to call it evening, too early to call it morning. The kind of hour where the whole world seems to be holding its breath. Above you, the sails hang stiff and pale, crusted in a thin shell of frost, barely stirring even when the ship rolls beneath the swell. A lantern swings near the base of the mainmast, its flame small and stubborn, throwing a weak circle of gold onto the ice-slick boards. The light bends strangely through the mist curling up off the black water, making shapes that aren't quite there. You can feel the cold pressing into your fingers first, then your ears, then settling somewhere behind your eyes, a dull ache that comes from breathing air this sharp. Somewhere below, a man is coughing, low and rough. Another voice mutters something in a language you don't recognize, maybe Frisian, maybe Low German, maybe just a prayer worn down to sound instead of words. The smell reaches you before you understand where it comes from. Tar, brine, and something sour underneath, wet wool that hasn't dried properly in weeks, and the faint tang of a barrel of ale that started to turn. You look up at the rigging and try to imagine a man climbing it in this weather. Bare hands on frozen rope, boots sliding on frost-slicked wood, all just to loosen a line before the ice could snap the yard in half. These weren't men who slept in soft berths and dreamed of gold doubloons under warm quilts. Most of the crew found rest wherever there was a gap to lie down without getting stepped on, coiled between cargo crates, wedged behind water casks, curled along the base of the mast where the wood was thickest and blocked a little wind. And when true winter arrived, when the northern seas turned genuinely savage, survival stopped being a matter of comfort and became a matter of arithmetic. How many hours could a body last exposed before the cold started shutting things down? How many layers stood between a man and the slow, quiet death that didn't announce itself with pain, just with a creeping, gentle tiredness that felt almost like sleep? You rub your palms together, trying to coax some feeling back into your fingertips. The air itself tastes strange, mineral, almost metallic, the way it does right before snow. Sailors of this era sometimes spoke of metal buckles and buttons sticking to bare skin in weather like this. A small, nasty trick of the cold that everyone learned the hard way exactly once. Ships of the period offered no real insulation. The hulls were caulked with tar and oakum, effective enough against water, useless against wind. Every seam let in a thread of cold air, and on the worst nights those threads combined into something that felt almost alive, a slow current of chill working its way through every gap in a man's clothing. Historians still debate how far north merchant and pirate crews really pushed during these centuries. Some argue the profits from northern trade routes justified almost any risk. Others think only the truly desperate men with nothing left to lose on friendlier waters ever sailed this far into the ice. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Out here, the cold wasn't simply weather. It became something closer to another member of the crew, uninvited, unpaying, and impossible to put ashore. You walk toward the bow and lean against the icy rail. Below you the sea looks almost solid, a slow rolling plain of gray-blue, broken here and there by pale slivers that might be ice, might be moonlight on water, hard to say which in this light. Somewhere beyond the horizon lie ports that have frozen shut for the season, fishermen who have hauled their boats up onto the shingle and won't touch the water again until spring. The men on this ship don't have that option. For them, the voyage continues regardless of what the sky decides to do. Here's a small, strange detail worth knowing. Sailors on the coldest routes sometimes rubbed rendered animal fat, whatever was available, seal, whale, even old cooking grease, into the skin of their hands and faces before trying to sleep. It wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. A thin layer of grease could hold in just enough warmth to keep frostbite from creeping into fingers overnight. It smelled dreadful, thick and faintly rancid, but no one much cared about smell when the alternative was losing a fingertip to the frost. You can almost imagine that smell now, mixing with the salt air, clinging faintly to the wool of every coat aboard. A narrow hatch nearby leaks a weak, flickering light from below. You step toward it. The air rising up through the gap feels warmer, though warmer here is a relative thing, more a change in kind than in degree. Down there, the crew will be packed close together under whatever cloth they could steal, trade, or stitch from scraps. Someone will be snoring through a jaw missing half its teeth. Someone else will be dreaming, maybe of gold he'll spend 100 times over in his sleep, and never once in daylight. Sleep aboard a ship like this was never gentle. It was a kind of ongoing negotiation, a truce struck nightly between total exhaustion and the low, constant hum of fear that never quite went silent. The wind picks up again, thin and keening through the frozen ropes above. You pull your collar tighter, though it does almost nothing against a cold this deep. Out here, comfort wasn't measured in softness. It was measured in survival. A night where nobody lost a toe to frostbite counted as good fortune. A morning where the hull hadn't cracked against drifting ice felt, in its own bleak way, like a small miracle. You glance upward. The stars are faint, smudged behind thin drifting cloud, but you can just make out the familiar shape of the plow, tilted low toward the horizon. The same stars that have watched centuries of frightened, freezing sailors do exactly what you're watching now. Keep moving, keep breathing, keep waiting for morning. The mast creaks steadily above you, a low, rhythmic sound that after a while starts to feel less like complaint and more like a kind of breathing. There's a strange beauty hidden in all this misery, if you let yourself notice it. Frost along the railing catches the lantern light and glitters faintly, like a scattering of glass dust. The sea itself moves in long, slow breaths, as if it too were half asleep. You think of the men below, each one carrying a private history you'll never fully know. Some are running from old debts. Some are running from old crimes. Some simply had nowhere else left to go. Tonight, all of that falls away, because tonight they share exactly one enemy, and it isn't each other. It's the cold, patient, and indifferent waiting just outside the hull. You run your palm along the icy rail and feel the thin crust flake away beneath your fingers, rough, real, undeniably there. For all its danger, this ship feels alive somehow, groaning and shifting under the strain like some enormous half-sleeping creature. Somewhere in the rigging, a line snaps free with a sharp crack, and a voice below curses softly in the dark. The sound fades quickly, swallowed by wind and distance. Historians who study these ships tend to focus on the battles fought, the cargo stolen, the flags flown. But the quieter truth, the human truth, lives in nights exactly like this one. In the fact that men slept with their boots still laced, because undressing in weather like this could mean death by morning. In the fact that a stolen blanket could start a fight that lasted longer than any storm. In the fact that sometimes, in the deepest hour of the coldest nights, someone would start humming, quiet and unsteady, just to remind the rest of the crew that they were all, somehow, still here. You feel the ship roll gently beneath your feet, and somewhere deep in the hold you hear cargo shifting, chains settling against wood. It's almost possible to imagine every sailor who has ever crossed water like this leaving behind some small trace of warmth in the endless cold, layer after layer, voyage after voyage, until the wood itself seems to remember it. Standing here beneath a brittle, star-flecked sky, You start to understand that this story was never really about treasure, or infamy, or the things men chase across dangerous water. It's about something far older and more fragile than any of that. It's about staying alive through one more freezing night, holding onto splintered, creaking wood, and quietly hoping the sea doesn't notice you're still there. Let's step further into that night. The deck shifts slightly under your boots as the ship settles into a long, slow swell. You can feel the boards flex just enough to remind you that this whole small world of timber and rope is floating on something vast, dark, and entirely indifferent to your comfort. The cold seems to sharpen with every passing minute, working its way through wool and leather like it's looking for something specific. Above you the ropes creak and answer each other, low complaining voices in a language made entirely of tension and frost. You move carefully along the icy rail, letting your hand trail against it. Thin moonlight spills across the deck in pale silver bands, catching every frozen surface and turning it to something that looks almost deliberately beautiful, frost like scattered powder, ice like carved glass along the edges of the rigging. Every breath you take rises in front of you and disappears just as quickly, swallowed by the dark. The sails themselves have gone strange and sculptural, stiffened by ice into shapes that no longer look much like cloth at all. You pause and listen. The ocean has gone almost perfectly silent tonight, except for the faint hiss of small waves against the hull, and somewhere nearby, a loose length of rope tapping steadily against the mast. An uneven, maddening little rhythm that could, you imagine, drive a sleepless man slowly out of his mind after enough nights in a row. You picture the crew below trying to rest through that exact sound, mixed with the groan of timber and the occasional shriek of wind finding a gap in the rigging. Sleep out here was a battle fought against noise as much as cold. The upper deck sits empty now. Most of the crew retreated below hours ago, chased down by the wind. You can almost picture their shapes moving in the dark beneath your feet, packed close in a space that smells of salt, sweat, and mildew. A lantern sways just above the open hatch, its light thin and gold, throwing slow, moving halos against the timber. You reach toward it without quite meaning to, and your fingers brush the cold metal handle. The burn of it is immediate, sharp enough that you pull back fast. Everything out here bites if you touch it carelessly. Even the ropes, stiffened with frozen salt, can cut a bare palm if gripped too tightly. It's easy to understand, standing here, why some sailors flatly refuse to climb into the rigging once true winter set in. One slip on ice-slick wood, and a man could vanish over the side into black water before anyone even noticed he was gone. Here's something worth knowing. These ships were never truly quiet, even on the calmest nights. The constant working of timber, the slap of waves against the hull, the low thrum of wind through taut rigging, all of it combined into a kind of living hum that never fully stopped. It became its own version of white noise, sharper and stranger than anything you'd hear on land, but familiar enough eventually that sailors grew almost dependent on it. Many who returned to solid ground afterward complained they couldn't sleep without it, some strange itch in the body expecting a rocking motion that never came. Then there's the smell. Every ship carried its own particular perfume of endurance, tar and salt, unwashed wool, the faint sweetness of rum gone slightly sour, and underneath it all something darker, damp rot, old grease, the smell of too many men confined too long in too little space. It was the smell of survival itself, unglamorous and impossible to escape. You continue toward the bow. The deck here is slick and shining under a fresh coat of rime, each line of frost catching the light like a thin vein of crystal. Somewhere deep in the hull you can hear the rhythmic rise and fall of snoring. It seems almost impossible that anyone could actually sleep through conditions like these, and yet they do. They have to. A sailor who couldn't manage rest at sea, even fragmented, uneasy rest, would lose his grip on sanity within a matter of weeks. The blunt truth settles in quietly, the way it tends to at this hour. Most of the men sleeping below tonight will not live to see old age. Cold, hunger, sickness, and violence take most of them long before that. You, standing here in your modern coat, likely wouldn't survive even a single week of this. The air alone feels capable of breaking a person's resolve. And yet here they are, resting between storms, wrapped in threadbare cloaks, curled into whatever corner offers the smallest shelter from the wind. Here's a curious little detail historians still find fascinating. Many of these sailors slept with a blade or a pistol tucked close, sometimes tied directly to a wrist or belt so it couldn't be stolen while they dreamed. It wasn't paranoia so much as plain practicality. Among men who'd already crossed most lines society drew, the space between waking and sleeping could be a dangerous place to leave undefended. You crouch and press your palm flat against the deck, feeling the faint vibration of the sea moving beneath the hull, slow and steady, almost like a heartbeat. The ship seems to speak through these small vibrations, whispering something about its age, its history, everything it's carried and everything it's lost along the way. You close your eyes for a moment and simply listen to the wind, the wood, the low murmuring hum of life continuing somewhere below. Historians continue to argue over whether crews preferred sleeping above deck or below during the harshest winter crossings. Some records suggest men chose to stay below for the shared body heat, despite the foul, close air. Others insist the lower decks grew so oppressive, so airless and reeking, that certain sailors would rather risk frostbite under open sky than spend another hour breathing that thick, stagnant warmth. Likely both were true, depending entirely on the man, the ship, and the particular misery of that particular night. The lantern flickers again. You lean your shoulder against the mast and feel its slow, steady pulse beneath you, the wood shifting gently with every roll of the ship, almost like some old animal breathing quietly in its sleep. Nearby ropes knock together in a soft, uneven rhythm. The whole world out here has narrowed down to just this ship, this sea, and the cold pressing patiently against every surface it touches. The horizon has vanished into cloud. It would be easy, standing here, to forget that land exists anywhere at all. Out here, sailors lived caught between two enormous, indifferent forces, frozen sky above, black water below, with nothing standing between the two but a thin skin of timber and hope. You take one last look across the frost-covered deck before turning toward the hatch. Every plank, every nail, every frozen puddle seems to hold some small fragment of human stubbornness. Down below, the men are resting, if what they're doing can honestly be called rest, while the ship groans and murmurs quietly around them. Standing here now, breath fogging in the cold air, you can almost feel a version of what they must have felt, that strange, uneasy peace suspended somewhere between exhaustion and fear, and underneath it all, the quiet, stubborn beauty of simply making it through one more night. Let's climb down and see how they slept. You climb down a short ladder into the lower deck, where the air thickens fast, heavy with tar, damp wood, and the close, warm smell of too many bodies packed into too little space. The sound of the sea fades into a low, muffled hum, replaced almost entirely by the creak of rope and the slow, steady sway of the ship settling into itself. Down here you finally see them properly, the sleeping crew, not tucked into soft berths, but strung up in narrow canvas hammocks that swing gently from side to side with every roll of the hull. Your breath catches a little at the sight of it. It feels like stepping into another world entirely, a floating cave rocking slowly through the dark. Lantern light spills across everything in dull amber, swinging lazily, sending long shadows crawling along the beams overhead. Each hammock cradles a shape wrapped tight in rough fabric. They look peaceful enough from here, but you already know better. The sea rarely lets anyone rest completely. There's a detail from early seafaring life worth knowing. Hammocks weren't first adopted for comfort at all. They were adopted for safety. Sailors learned early on that sleeping directly on the deck was genuinely dangerous. One hard roll of the ship could send a man crashing into a bulkhead or straight across the floor. Hammocks solved that problem by moving with the ship instead of fighting against it, cradling the body rather than throwing it around. Crews on ships like this one adopted the same solution quickly, once they understood the difference it made to a man's ribs. You step closer and touch the edge of the nearest hammock. The fabric feels stiff with dried salt and cold, its fibers rough and slightly gritty under your fingers. It's not hard to imagine how that same rough cloth must have felt against skin already raw from days of exposure to salt air. A small, curious detail some records mention: certain sailors lined their hammocks with whatever scraps of fur or stolen sailcloth they could get their hands on, anything that might trap a little extra warmth. The fabric would carry the smell of smoke and salt and old sweat, but that particular smell meant survival. Listening to the slow, uneven rhythm of the hammock swaying, you start to notice something almost hypnotic in it. Each one creaks at a slightly different pitch, and together they blend into a strange, layered lullaby, heavy with the weight of time itself swinging gently back and forth. The ship seems to sigh along with them, sharing the same tired rhythm. One man shifts in his sleep nearby, murmuring something you can't quite make out. Another rolls over hard enough to send his hammock spinning lazily before it settles again. Somewhere above, water drips steadily through a seam in the deck, landing in a bucket with a small, patient plink. A thin draft slides down through the cracks, making the lantern flame gutter and lean. You pull your coat tighter, though the cold down here clings differently, damp and heavy rather than sharp. It's tempting to assume sailors simply grew numb to hardship like this, but exhaustion breaks down even the toughest men eventually. Records from merchant vessels of the same period describe crews working 18 hours or more in brutal conditions, sleeping only in short, broken stretches. Life depended on constant alertness, so real rest came only in fragments: 2 hours here, 3 there, never a full night, never anything close to deep sleep. Not when any given creak of the hull might mean a serious leak, or worse. Experts still can't agree on exactly how crews structured their sleeping shifts during the harshest winter voyages. Some argue for something close to a formal rotation, similar to naval watch systems, half the crew resting while the other half stayed alert. Others suspect life aboard less disciplined ships was messier than that, men simply collapsing wherever exhaustion finally caught up with them. The truth is probably scattered somewhere in between, buried in salt and silence along with everything else this sea swallowed. You glance around the cramped space. The hammocks hang close enough together that they touch whenever the ship rolls. You could reach out and brush your fingers across 3 sleeping men without taking a single step. Down here, privacy simply doesn't exist. Every breath, every snore, every murmured half-dream becomes part of one shared, tangled existence. It occurs to you that even here, this crew has become something like a family, bound less by loyalty than by sheer necessity. Try to imagine the air on the coldest of these nights, heavy and damp, your own breath fogging even indoors. Moisture beads along the walls. The ropes feel permanently damp to the touch. The smell of wet wool and packed bodies fills every breath you take, thick enough that you can almost taste the salt in it. Then a sharp crack splits the quiet. Somewhere above, a line has snapped under the strain of the frost. A few sleeping men stir, murmuring. One cracks an eye open, then closes it again almost immediately. These are men who have long since learned to sleep through nearly anything. The steady slap of waves against the hull has become nothing more than background music to them now. Motion that would leave you seasick within minutes rocks them gently towards sleep, the same way it might rock a child. Here's a small, oddly human detail drawn from old accounts. Sailors, pirates included, often hummed quietly to themselves before drifting off, a way of steadying their nerves against the dark. A tune might pass from one hammock to the next, shifting slightly each time it changed hands, not quite music, not quite prayer, but something suspended between the two. It helped keep fear at bay while storms gathered somewhere out past the hull. On certain nights, it said the ship itself seemed to hum back, the old wood vibrating faintly along with their low, tired voices. You close your eyes for a moment and simply listen. The sway of the hammocks, the soft crackle of lantern light, the occasional distant drip of seawater, it all blurs together into something that feels almost eternal. This, it seems, is how they endured the cold, not by defeating it outright but by learning to move with it, accepting it as simply part of this strange, floating world they'd chosen or been forced into. There's a particular kind of beauty in that balance if you let yourself see it. Each hammock is its own fragile cocoon, holding a life suspended somewhere between danger and dream. Outside, the sea remains black and endless, indifferent to everything happening within these narrow wooden walls. But in here, men drift in and out of half-sleep, trusting that the ropes will hold, and that the ship somehow will keep floating until morning finds them again. You open your eyes and watch the shadows shift along the beams. For just a moment you forget the cold entirely, forget the history, forget the danger waiting outside. You simply see motion and rest, life and sleep swaying gently together under the enormous, patient weight of the sea above. Let's go a little deeper into the ship's belly. You duck lower as the space narrows, careful to avoid the low beams overhead. The air thickens further with every step forward, growing heavier, warmer in a way that isn't exactly comforting. This isn't a clean kind of heat. It's stale, trapped beneath the planks for weeks, mixed with salt, smoke, and the close smell of human breath. Your boots stick faintly to floorboards slick with condensation dripping steadily from above. The dim lantern light barely reaches the corners of this space. A single flame swings from a hook, struggling against drafts slipping in through every seam in the hull. The glow trembles weakly across sleeping shapes and open storage barrels. Every object here throws a shifting, wavering shadow that seems almost alive in the low light. You can hear quiet snoring, the soft rustle of fabric shifting, and every so often the faint clink of metal as someone turns over and a blade taps gently against the wood beside them. The walls down here are rough, patched wherever old leaks have been sealed over the years. The hull creaks with every swell, and a single icy drop of water lands squarely on the back of your neck. You flinch. This, more than the open deck above, is where sailors truly lived at sea, not under moonlight and open sky, but down here in the damp gloom, half buried among ropes, barrels, and each other. Old journals from sailors of this era describe the lower deck as both haven and prison at once. Above, the wind could kill a man with frost alone. Down here, the thick, stagnant air threatened to choke him first, and yet most men still preferred it. Even foul, stagnant air felt somehow kinder than the open bite of the northern sky. A curious truth about life below deck: sound travels strangely down here. Everything echoes. A man coughing in the far corner can be heard clearly across the entire space. Conversations naturally drop into whispers, and whispers just as naturally slide into secrets. This was where alliances quietly formed, where old grudges simmered, where stories passed from man to man between shallow breaths. The cold ruled the world above, but down here, whatever warmth existed came from company alone. You crouch beside a pile of tattered blankets nearby. The fabric feels coarse under your hand, patched together from mismatched scraps, some wool, some old linen, some worn so thin you could see clean through them if you held them to the light. The smell rising off the pile is heavy and earthy. You can easily picture 2 or 3 men sharing a single blanket like this, wrapped together in exhausted silence, pride long since abandoned in favor of simply staying warm enough to see morning. In one corner, a smaller figure catches your eye, a boy who can't be older than 14 or 15, knees drawn tight to his chest, back pressed against a storage barrel. Crews like this one often kept younger hands aboard for the dirtiest, most thankless jobs, scrubbing decks, running messages between watch stations, patching whatever leaks turned up overnight. Many of these boys never lived to see land again. For them, this cramped lower deck served as bedroom, classroom, and nightmare, all folded into one small space. You reach out and press your palm flat against the hull. The wood feels cold and damp beneath your fingers, but it pulses faintly with the rhythm of the waves outside, every vibration of the sea passing straight through the timber and into your hand. It's genuinely hard to imagine sleeping through a constant sway like that. And yet, night after night, that's exactly what this crew managed to do. For them, sleep was never really about comfort. It was about escape, however brief. Accounts from explorers of this same period suggest that crews often divided the cramped hold into rough sleeping sections, using hanging ropes or scraps of cloth strung between beams. It created the illusion of privacy, even though true privacy never really existed down here. A single cough or cry could cut straight through those thin barriers without any trouble at all. Some sailors even carved small protective symbols into the beams nearest their own hammocks, quiet little hopes for safety against whatever the sea might decide to do next. There's a strangely touching detail preserved in a handful of surviving ship logs. During the very worst stretches of winter weather, some crews kept a single glowing ember tucked inside a covered bowl of sand, guarding it like a small treasure. That ember would glow faintly through the darkest hours of the night, a fragile, stubborn promise of warmth. Sailors sometimes called it the heart of the ship. If it ever went out, the belief was that bad luck would soon follow. Historians today still can't say for certain how widespread this particular practice really was, whether it belonged to many crews or only a handful of especially desperate ones. The evidence is thin, part folklore, part fact. But even just imagining it now, the meaning is easy enough to understand. In the total blackness of a ship's hold, one small red ember must have felt like life itself, distilled down to its simplest possible form. You linger a while longer in that dim, close space, imagining the stories that must have passed back and forth here night after night. Men bragging about raids that went better than they deserved. Others whispering about storms that nearly swallowed the whole ship whole. A few, quieter than the rest, simply remembering homes they suspected they'd never see again. All those voices must have blended eventually with the creaks and drips into something like the ship's own private music. The air grows heavier the longer you stay, and you start to notice the layers of sound stacking on top of each other, the rhythmic thump of waves against the hull, the faint weaving hiss of wind slipping through cracks, the low groan of sleepers shifting inside their hammocks. All of it merges into something oddly comforting, a pulse the whole ship seems to share, lungs full of salt and half-formed dreams. You kneel beside one hammock and study its occupant for a moment, a man with a tangled, frost-flecked beard, face half buried in coarse cloth, one arm hanging loosely toward the floor. His hand twitches faintly, as though even in sleep he's still gripping a rope or the hilt of a knife. Out here, the sea never quite allows a man to fully let go of his work, not even in dreams. For a moment you close your eyes yourself and try to imagine actually sleeping in a place like this. The oppressive, trapped heat pressing down, the mingled smell of mildew and sweat, timber walls sighing with every swell of the sea. And yet, somewhere inside all that discomfort, there's something almost gentle too. The sway of the ship rocks you whether you ask for it or not, a crude cradle carved straight out of hardship. One forgotten sailor once scrawled a note in the margin of his logbook, claiming that below deck, the ship herself seems to hold her breath. Standing here now, you understand exactly what he meant. The air feels thick, but strangely quiet, as though the entire vessel is pausing while her crew sleeps. Above, the cold night continues to howl. Down here in this narrow, dim cocoon, the men find whatever fragile peace they can manage before the waves wake them again at dawn. You climb back up toward the main deck, where a thin gray light has just begun leaking through the cracks in the planking above. Cold air greets you immediately, biting hard against your cheeks the second you clear the hatch. The smell of open ocean returns, sharp and clean, cutting through the lingering scent of tar and old rope still clinging to your coat. The sky has turned the color of hammered steel, and you catch the first faint whisper of snow riding on the wind. The crew is beginning to stir now. One man stretches until his joints crack audibly. Another coughs, breath rising in small pale clouds. You notice how mismatched their clothing looks, nothing close to uniform, just whatever fabric each man managed to steal, trade, or stitch back together over the course of the voyage. That patchwork tells its own quiet story about survival. Documents from the period describe sailors typically layering wool directly against the skin, then linen over that, then a heavier outer layer of canvas or hide. Crews like this one followed roughly the same logic, wrapping themselves in whatever combination could trap the most warmth. Some resorted to stranger materials entirely, old robes, torn tapestries, anything salvageable reworked into a crude cloak. Appearance mattered far less than function out here. Warmth was worth infinitely more than pride. You watch one sailor carefully wind a strip of faded red cloth twice around his neck, tucking the ends beneath his chin while muttering something about keeping the cold's fingers off his throat. Superstition, maybe, but a common one. Many sailors genuinely believed the cold carried something with it, some invisible sickness that could creep into a man's lungs while he slept unguarded. A scarf, in that light, wasn't just comfort. It was protection. The wind picks up sharply, snapping at the stiffened sails above. You pull your own coat tighter, feeling frost already forming along nearby ropes, stiffening every knot a little further. The crew rubs at their hands, stamping their boots against the deck, trying to force warmth back into numb limbs. One man laughs bitterly and mutters that the sea steals heat faster than it ever steals gold. Old merchant records describe winter voyages as more a test of raw endurance than of navigational skill. The sea itself would freeze at the edges, sails would stiffen past usefulness, and men died less often from dramatic storms than from a slow, creeping cold that simply never let go. Crews packed extra blankets when they could get them, but mostly they just layered whatever they owned, and when even that failed, stuffed spare cloth with moss, straw, or scraps torn from ruined sails, anything at all that might slow the wind from finding bare skin. A small but genuinely fascinating detail from northern crews of the period: some rubbed rendered animal fat across their faces and hands before nightfall, a crude but effective form of insulation that helped trap body heat and kept moisture from freezing directly onto exposed skin. The smell must have been dreadful, thick, and fishy, but the men who relied on it swore by it, insisting it saved their fingers more than once. The cold out here isn't just a passing sensation. It feels like an actual presence, seeping into everything, from the grain of the deck planking to the marrow of the sailor's bones. You notice how their movements have slowed, grown careful and deliberate, each man conserving energy with every small motion. There's no open fire allowed on deck, only the faint, shared warmth of bodies working close together. Historians remain divided on whether northern crews typically carried extra furs looted from other ships, or relied purely on whatever naval supplies they'd managed to steal along the way. Some records suggest plundered vessels regularly provided decent coats, taken from soldiers and merchants alike. Others argue that crews living this chaotically simply couldn't stockpile much of anything reliably. The truth probably shifted from ship to ship, season to season. What does seem clear is that nobody who survived a winter crossing faced that same cold unprepared twice. You crouch to examine the deck boards more closely. Frost has worked its way deep into the grain, turning patches of wood almost white. Your breath rises and vanishes almost instantly in the cold air. You find yourself wondering how these men must have felt each morning, shaking frost out of stiffened hammocks, forcing boots back onto feet after a night of the leather freezing rock hard. Some surely cursed the sea every single morning. Others, it's said, simply laughed at it, understanding perfectly well that complaint never once made the water any warmer. It's easy, from a distance of centuries, to forget that ships of this era carried essentially no real insulation at all. The planking was thin, sealed only with pitch and tightly packed oakum, both of which tended to crack under deep cold. Every gust of wind found some seam to slip through. Every fresh splash of seawater froze solid within minutes of landing on deck. If a man's clothing got soaked through, his only real option was to strip it off immediately and beat the ice out of it against the mast before it could freeze him from the outside in. A sudden cry cuts through the quiet, sharp and clear, a gull somewhere overhead, clearly as lost and displeased with this weather as anyone aboard. A few of the men glance upward and manage a tired laugh, one joking that even the birds know better than to be out here in this kind of winter. The laughter is short-lived, but genuine while it lasts. Humor, out here, has become one of the last real comforts still available to them. You take one more slow look around the deck. Every man is bundled differently, one in patched wool, another layered in scavenged sailcloth, a third wrapped in something that might once have been a wall hanging from some looted cabin. Together they look less like an organized crew and more like a small band of ghosts, draped in whatever scraps the world had already discarded. There's something strangely beautiful in it anyway, faded reds and browns and grays catching the weak morning light, the wind tugging at loose edges of fabric until the whole scene looks almost like a painting nobody meant to make. Then a sharp crack breaks the stillness. A line somewhere above has finally given way under the strain of the frost. The crew looks up as one. Someone curses under their breath. Bodies that were sluggish just seconds ago move fast now, instinct cutting through the cold-slowed reflexes. You watch their breath trail behind them like smoke as they scramble to secure the damage. When the line is finally lashed back into place, the ship seems to exhale and settle back into its steady rhythm. The sea murmurs quietly against the hull. Somewhere nearby, a man yawns hard enough to crack his jaw and mutters something about the cold creeping straight into his dreams last night. You understand exactly what he means. Out here, the cold doesn't politely wait for sleep before it finds you. Watching them work, you start to realize that all this mismatched, patched-together clothing amounts to more than simple protection from weather. It's armor in its own quiet way, against both the elements and against despair itself. Every scrap of fabric, every patch stitched by exhausted, half-frozen fingers, tells its own small story about men who have simply refused to give up. And so they keep moving, wrapped in their odd mismatched layers, breath rising like pale ghosts into the morning air, while above them the frost-stiffened sails crack softly in the wind, and the ship carries its shivering crew forward across an unforgiving stretch of water. You follow a faint drift of wood smoke toward the galley, that small, cramped space where this crew cooks, argues, and occasionally manages something close to warmth. The passage narrows as you move, boots thudding softly against old boards. The air here feels heavier, carrying the smell of scorched fat mixed with tar. Somewhere close by, metal clinks softly against metal, and you can almost taste iron in the air. Inside, the light is dim, shaped by a single swinging oil lamp that throws trembling amber light across the walls. A small blackened hearth sits built from stone and reinforced with iron plate, a few embers glowing weakly at its center, though no real open flame burns. Crews of this era understood the danger of fire on a wooden hull all too well. Naval records from the period make clear that a single stray spark could turn an entire ship into an inferno long before anyone reached open water to escape it. Faced with that risk, most crews chose the cold over the fire, every single time. You crouch near the hearth, watching that tiny glow pulse weakly in the dark. The air smells of damp wood, salted meat, and smoke that's had days to settle into every surface. A few sailors gather close around it like moths drawn to a candle, careful never to actually touch the hot iron. Their fingers look cracked and raw from days of exposure. A couple of them nurse tin cups of rum, eyes fixed on the embers as though silent prayer alone might keep the fire from finally dying out completely. Here's a small, curious detail preserved in old ship's logs. To generate warmth without risking open flame, some crews filled iron pots with heated stones or sand, sealed the top with cloth, and carried these makeshift heaters below deck. The warmth lasted for hours this way, just long enough to thaw stiffened fingers or melt a crust of ice off frozen rope. You can almost picture the smell of faintly scorched cloth mixing with salt air as one gets passed hand to hand. Above, the wind rises again, pressing steadily against every crack in the hull. The lamp flickers, throwing long shadows dancing across the walls. The men here have gone quiet, moving slowly and deliberately. One scrapes the last remains of a meal from his pan. Another wipes his blade clean against his sleeve, muttering about the cold finally settling into his bones for good this time. They talk about warmth the way other men might talk about treasure, like something precious, something worth protecting at any cost. Modern historians still debate exactly how crews on the coldest routes managed to generate enough heat to survive extended winter voyages. Some argue for small, carefully shielded braziers, lit only when the sea was calm enough to risk it. Others believe sealed oil lanterns, Their weak heat multiplied by tightly packed bodies and heavy wool did most of the real work. Whatever the truth, it was clearly a dangerous balance to strike. One wrong move away from death by fire on one side, or death by frost on the other. You settle beside them in the dim light. The glow from the coals seems to breathe faintly, rising and falling with some rhythm all its own. Every few seconds, a sailor leans forward with a stick to stir the ashes, coaxing what little life remains out of the heat. When warmth briefly returns to the room, you can feel the whole space relax slightly, shoulders dropping, eyes half closing in shared relief. Then someone laughs softly, breaking the quiet. He points toward a battered copper kettle hanging nearby, its handle wrapped in old rope, a small carved wooden charm shaped roughly like a fish dangling from the hook. It's meant, he explains, as a small promise, a bit of luck to keep the ship from ever catching fire. The others grin and reach out to tap it before returning to their work. A sailor's life in this period was full of small tokens like this: carved bone, scraps of shell, bits of driftwood shaped by patient hands, each one carrying its own private story. These weren't luxuries. They were a kind of portable faith, solid enough to hold onto when the world outside had turned entirely to ice and salt. The ship tilts slightly beneath you, and a few drops of hot water spill from a pot, hissing sharply against the cold floor. The men curse quietly, moving fast to steady the pans. Someone jokes that the ship herself must be jealous of a little warmth for once. Laughter ripples through the small space again, brief but entirely genuine, proof enough that spirits can still catch fire even when the hearth itself cannot. Outside, the wind continues to build. You can hear the sails straining hard now, ropes humming under real tension. The sound travels down through the timber, a quiet reminder that the cold is never truly gone, only waiting patiently just beyond these walls. The sailors glance upward instinctively at the sound. Out here, the sea is never very far away, no matter how deep below deck you manage to climb. A curious account from a 14th century voyage mentions crews using heated stones wrapped in cloth as makeshift bed warmers, tucked beneath a hammock an hour before a man meant to sleep. The stone would hold its warmth long after the fire that heated it had gone cold, radiating just enough heat to make the difference between a bearable night and a truly miserable one. It's hard to say how widespread the practice really was, but the logic behind it is easy enough to understand even now. You lean back against a beam, letting the faint music of the sea against the hull wash over you. Above, the wind continues its steady, restless song. The sailors around the hearth stretch out slowly, shoulders finally loosening in the dim light, breath misting faintly above them. For a brief moment, the whole room feels almost human, almost safe. Then the lamp gutters and the cold slips quietly back in, patient as ever. The warmth fades fast, leaving behind only the smell of ash and salt. You can feel the shift in the air immediately, that same old reminder that no comfort out here ever lasts very long. But in this fleeting moment, with the embers glowing low and the men's eyes growing heavy, the cold seems, for just a little while, to have stepped back and given them room to breathe. You climb back up toward the middeck, where the light has turned thin and blue, the unmistakable sign that day is arriving, even if the sun hasn't yet managed to burn off the mist. The air feels brittle, almost sharp enough to shatter if you breathe too hard. Above you, the rigging hums steadily in the wind, sails straining, timber creaking in that same slow, patient rhythm. It isn't the sound of chaos. It's the sound of duty, quiet and unglamorous, the ship simply refusing to stop even when her crew desperately wants to. The rotation of night watches shapes the rhythm of everyone's life aboard. Like naval crews of the same era, sailors here divided their hours into shifts, some men keeping guard while others rested, a bell marking each change. It was the only reliable clock anyone truly trusted out here. You can almost hear the tone of it now, dull and distant, cutting cleanly through whatever fragile dreams a man managed to hold onto. Historical accounts from privateering crews describe these watch rotations as equal parts discipline and curse. Too much rest courted danger. Too little invited a slow unraveling of the mind. Crews like this one, rarely fond of rigid order to begin with, often bent the schedule to whatever suited them in the moment, some sleeping in tight 2-hour bursts, others refusing sleep entirely until sheer exhaustion finally dragged them down. What mattered wasn't really the number of hours logged, but the rhythm itself, the steady, unbroken pulse of a ship's life that simply never stopped moving. You lean against the railing, feeling the cold bite straight through your gloves. The horizon glows faintly now, the first true promise of morning. A few sailors shuffle up from below, eyes still blurry with sleep, hair matted with frost. One yawns hard enough that you actually hear his jaw crack. Another splashes a handful of icy seawater across his face, gasps sharply at the shock of it, then laughs despite himself. Their voices sound rough, hoarse, but unmistakably alive. The next watch has officially begun. A fascinating note preserved in one 16th century sailor's diary reveals that men standing watch often used music of a kind to keep themselves from drifting off. Low rhythmic humming, quiet stamping of feet, the steady tap of a spoon against a barrel, all timed loosely to the rocking of the ship. You can almost hear it now, a slow, murmuring percussion drifting across the deck like a heartbeat made of habit. The man at the wheel grips it tightly, fingers red and visibly cracked from cold. The ship tilts slightly as he corrects the course. Beside him, another sailor squints into the mist, watching carefully for shapes that might mean drift ice or worse, an unfriendly sail. Neither speaks. There's no real need to. Out here, silence has become its own quiet language, understood without translation. There's something almost meditative in the way they move, as though the body simply learns, eventually, to follow the ocean's own rhythm. You begin to understand why so many sailors of this era described the sea as both torment and teacher in the same breath. The endless motion works its way into the bones over time, until even in sleep the body keeps rocking gently, as if still standing watch. It's said that men returning to solid land after long voyages sometimes swayed unconsciously for days afterward, bodies still trying to balance against waves that were no longer there. Not every watch passes peacefully. Sometimes the darkness hides more than simple waves. One sailor glances repeatedly over his shoulder, checking shadows as though half expecting something to climb up out of the black water itself. Old sailors' tailies spoke of things that followed ships silently. Waiting for the exact moment, a man slipped and went overboard unnoticed. The fear of being lost alone in that endless dark water ran deeper for most of these men than any fear of battle ever did. The rotation continues on schedule. The sailors who just finished their shift stumble below deck, faces gray with fatigue, one rubbing absently at his own chest as though trying to chase away a chill that never fully leaves. They'll sleep now, assuming the noise and cold allow it, until the bell eventually calls them back up again. Experts today still discuss just how much genuine rest crews like this one actually managed during long winter voyages. Some estimates suggest less than 4 hours of real sleep per day was common. Others argue that the looser discipline aboard less regimented ships occasionally allowed for longer stretches of rest between raids or storms, a small luxury few naval crews could ever claim for themselves. The honest truth likely sits somewhere in the blur between exhaustion and pure necessity. You step closer to the mainmast, where a lantern still hangs, flame flickering weakly but steady enough to spread thin light across the frost clinging to nearby ropes and rails. You run a finger along one line, feeling the stiff crust of salt that's formed overnight. It crunches faintly under your touch. Out here, everything eventually gets touched by the sea, right down to the smallest individual fiber. One sailor on watch begins to whistle softly, a slow tune that sounds closer to morning than to music. The others glance his way but don't ask him to stop. The sound drifts through the cold air, curling around the mast before fading into the distance. It fills the silence without quite breaking it. In this steady rhythm, the ship starts to feel almost like a single living organism. Each man functions as one small part of it, each watch another beat of a shared, larger heart. When one piece falters, The rest simply carry the weight a little longer. That understanding, more than any code or oath, seems to bind this crew together. The ocean, in its own harsh way, teaches unity through fear. A small tradition mentioned in a handful of old crew accounts describes the passing of a token during each change of watch, sometimes a carved bead, sometimes a simple button or knotted scrap of rope, meant to symbolize the weight of responsibility being handed over. The sailor beginning his shift would hold it briefly, murmur something only he could hear, then tie it to his wrist until the next bell. To lose it or drop it into the sea was considered a genuinely bad omen. You picture rough, cold-cracked hands exchanging that small object in the freezing air, a simple gesture carrying far more weight than its size would suggest. The sky brightens by degrees, a faint promise of daylight edging in. The sea itself stays dark, though here and there it catches a glimmer where drifting ice floats past. You watch the sailors scan the horizon, eyes narrowed hard against the wind. Sleep still clings faintly to their faces, but alertness returns slowly, steadily, the way it always does. The bell rings again, a hollow sound quickly swallowed by mist. Another rotation begins, another quiet trade between rest and duty. It occurs to you that this rhythm never really stops, not for weather, not for exhaustion, not even for fear itself. The ship's survival depends on it continuing, watch after watch, night after night. You close your eyes for a moment and let the sound of that bell settle in your chest. It doesn't feel harsh anymore. It feels almost like breathing, steady and calm, an anchor holding against the wider chaos of the sea. This crew lives and sleeps by that rhythm, and in this strange, borrowed moment so do you. The following evening the cold deepens further, the air growing heavy enough that it feels almost drinkable. The sky has bruised itself into shades of deep purple, and the waves have slowed into a thick, sluggish roll. The ship moves through the water like something tired, worn down by the weight of the crossing. Lanterns sway lazily and the crew gathers close together, faces shadowed and pale in the weak light. Tonight, it seems, whatever rum remains will be the only real warmth reaching them. The smell hits you first, sweet, sharp, faintly earthy, molasses mixed with old smoke. A flask passes down the line without a word exchanged, each man taking his turn. The drink burns going down, but it also softens the hard edges of the cold, blurs them just slightly. One sailor sighs with obvious relief after his swallow, as though he can finally feel his own heartbeat again. Old journals from this period often describe strong drink as both comfort and curse aboard ships like this one. It numbed pain, quieted fear, and filled empty stomachs when proper food ran short. But it also dulled reflexes, frayed already thin tempers, and occasionally fueled fights that ended with blood on the planks. Crews without naval discipline had no rationing system to fall back on. A single cask might last a week, or disappear in a single desperate night, depending entirely on the crew's mood. You sit near the group, listening to their low, rough talk. Laughter carries easily in the still air tonight, low and worn at the edges. Their stories wander somewhere between memory and pure invention, stitched loosely together by however many cups they've already had. One man describes a raid gone sideways near some southern coastline, claiming they drank more that night than they actually fought. Another swears he once watched frost form so thick on a man's beard that it cracked clean off when he tried to smile. Here's an odd little detail drawn from old sailors' accounts. Some crews mix their rum directly with seawater, partly to stretch a limited supply further, partly to soften the shock of drinking it straight in weather this cold. They called the mixture grog, a term that would later work its way into formal naval tradition. The added salt made thirst worse afterward, but somehow easier on throats already numbed by cold. You can almost taste it now, sharp and briny, as though the ocean itself had found its way directly into the cup. Lantern light catches the surface of a passing bottle, turning it amber in the dark. The sailors watch it the way someone on land might watch a fireplace, hypnotized, half-comforted. The drink becomes a kind of trick played on the body, a substitute for real heat, at least for a little while. Somewhere above, the wind moans softly through the rigging. One man begins humming under his breath, voice cracked and low. A few others join in, the melody slow and uncertain, something closer to an old lullaby than any proper song, something that seems to belong to the sea itself rather than to any single sailor. Modern researchers still debate whether alcohol genuinely helped sailors survive these cold crossings, or simply created a dangerous illusion of warmth, one that drew heat from the body even faster once the effect wore off. Others argue that in careful, modest doses, it offered a kind of real comfort, enough to keep despair from sinking too deep on the worst nights. What nobody really disputes is its effect on morale. A warm drink, however dangerous, kept spirits from breaking even when bodies were struggling. One sailor wipes his mouth, grinning through cracked, wind-chapped lips, and taps his bottle once against the mast. "To the cold," he says, "may it drink slower than we do tonight." The others laugh, though it's the particular kind of laughter that hides something more brittle just underneath. The ship rolls gently, lantern light rippling across the deck in slow waves. A few men lean back against nearby barrels, eyes half closed, words slurring softly into one another. Drink has a way of making time slip sideways out here, minutes stretching into hours without anyone quite noticing the difference. But peace like this rarely holds for very long. A shout suddenly cuts across the deck, sharp and slurred, two men arguing hard over a cup that's gone missing. The sound rises fast, jagged against the quiet night. One shoves the other, and the rest of the crew moves quickly to pull them apart before things escalate further, hands gripping shoulders, voices dropped low, trying not to wake the whole ship. The argument fizzles out almost as fast as it started, leaving only a tense, uneasy silence behind it. A quiet superstition drifted among sailors of this era, that spilling drink on deck angered the spirits of men who drowned before them, as though the liquid, once it touched the wood, belonged to the sea rather than to the living. It's said that after a scuffle like this one, a sailor might tip a few drops over the rail afterward, murmuring something into the dark water below, a small offering meant to smooth over whatever offense had just been given. You watch one of the men do exactly that now, tilting the bottle slightly, lips moving in something too quiet to catch. The wind carries the smell of drink across the deck, mixing with salt air. Below, a few sailors stir faintly in their hammocks, murmuring in half-formed dreams. Maybe they're dreaming of dry taverns, firelight, soft beds waiting somewhere far to the south. Maybe they're simply dreaming of warmth that never runs out. The bottle finally comes back around to you. You lift it, and the taste is harsh but undeniably alive. It burns for a moment, then fades, leaving behind the strange, shared comfort of something passed hand to hand. The cold is still there, pressing at your face, working into your fingers, but it feels a little softer now, as though it's agreed for tonight at least to wait its turn. By dawn, the drink is gone, leaving the air thick with the smell of salt, smoke, and tired, worn-out laughter. The crew has gone quiet again, voices fading into whispers as the cold reasserts itself. You watch them settle into their corners, pulling threadbare blankets tight, eyelids heavy but strangely restless. Sleep arrives differently at sea. It isn't so much rest as retreat, a thin, fragile membrane stretched between exhaustion and memory. You lean against a wooden beam, feeling the ship sway gently beneath you, almost like breathing. The men drift slowly into an uneasy kind of slumber, faces softening, bodies curling inward against the cold. The sound of the sea blends with their slow, uneven breathing. Somewhere above, rope knocks softly against the mast in a rhythm that feels, oddly, almost deliberate, almost gentle. Old letters from captured sailors of this period describe how crews often dreamed vividly of solid land, describing beaches, open fires, soft beds, as though these ordinary comforts had become something close to miracles. Some claim to dream of gold spilling from unseen chests, only for the coins to vanish the moment they reach to grab them. You can imagine the particular frustration in that, longing twisted quietly into nightmare. The colder the sea outside, the sweeter and more painful these dreams apparently became. A curious fragment survives in an old ballad from the region, claiming that any sailor who dreamed of open flame during deep winter wouldn't live to see spring again. Fire in dreams marked as an omen of fever, storm, or violence to come. The crew here sometimes joked about the superstition, but you sense, watching their faces now, that at least half of them quietly believed it anyway. When warmth itself has become this rare a luxury, even imagined fire starts to feel dangerous. One sailor turns in his hammock, murmuring something under his breath that sounds almost like the word home. You imagine him from somewhere green and far away, somewhere with real trees, real smoke curling from a real hearth. Around him, others shift and sigh, tangled loosely in their hammocks like fish caught gently in a net. The ship rocks, and the hammocks answer in kind. From where you're standing, it almost looks peaceful. From a historian's perspective, dreams offered one of the only true escapes available to sailors on voyages like this one. Diaries from the period mention recurring visions among crews who'd spent too long away from solid ground, dreams of silent land, of walking somewhere that didn't constantly shift beneath their feet, of hearing birdsong instead of endless waves. For men whose entire existence had narrowed down to danger and constant motion, these dreams might genuinely have felt like something close to heaven. You close your own eyes for a moment, trying to imagine their inner world. Even the smell of salt seems to seep into dream itself out here. The motion of the ship never fully disappears, even in sleep. You might dream of walking through some ordinary market, only to feel the ground tilt strangely beneath you. You might see a familiar face from childhood, only to watch it dissolve slowly into the shape of a wave. The mind, it seems, never entirely releases its grip on the sea once the sea has properly taken hold of it. Modern researchers still discuss whether the extreme isolation of these long voyages produced something close to shared hallucination among crews, whether malnutrition and monotony gradually warped perception, or whether the endless rhythm of the waves acted almost like a form of hypnosis, pulling the mind into some hazy space between waking and dreaming. Whatever the true cause, the sea clearly had a way of slipping quietly into even the most private corners of sleep. The men around you shift again in their hammocks. One laughs softly at something only he can see. Another curses under his breath. Somewhere nearby, someone snores loudly enough that a couple of others chuckle faintly in their sleep before falling still again. The shared warmth of their bodies fills the small space with a faint mist. Lantern light flickers across the ceiling beams, throwing slow, golden waves that rise and fall in time with the ship's gentle motion. You remember that many of these sailors were, not so long ago, simple fishermen or merchant hands who happened to fall into this harder life by accident or desperation, rather than by any real choice. Perhaps their dreams carried fragments of that other, gentler life still echoing quietly in the dark, a house near some harbor, a familiar voice, the smell of fresh bread. For all their rough edges, these were still, underneath everything, ordinary men, and the night seemed determined to remind them of it. One fragment survives in a prisoner's testimony from the period, describing a sailor who refused outright to sleep below deck, insisting he couldn't bear to dream of dry land while still trapped at sea. He slept instead on the open deck, wrapped tightly in old sailcloth, face turned up toward the stars. The rest of the crew mocked him gently for it, calling him something like ghost lover, but he always answered that it helped him remember he was still, in some sense, free. The testimony notes, almost in passing, that he vanished at sea only a few weeks later. You listen now to the sea moving steadily outside the hull. It whispers against the timber in a voice almost too quiet to properly understand. It sounds, in this moment, strangely tender. Perhaps that's exactly why sailors of this era came to both love and resent it in equal measure. It stole their freedom and their peace in the same breath it offered them riches and, eventually, death. In dreams, perhaps, they tried in their own small way to make some kind of peace with it, if only for a few stolen hours before the bell called them back. A nearly forgotten detail preserved in one ship's log mentions that certain crews actively encouraged storytelling before sleep, understood almost as a way of shaping what the mind might see once the eyes finally closed. The stories themselves stayed simple, sometimes about treasure, sometimes just about food, but they seemed to work regardless. Men reportedly slept a little easier after imagining something specific worth surviving for. You can feel that same rhythm settling through the space now. The murmured breathing, the creak of hammocks, the long, low sigh of the sea outside. It feels ancient somehow, almost sacred in its own quiet way. The dreams moving through this ship tonight aren't peaceful exactly, but they are alive, carrying a kind of warmth no fire could ever quite match, the warmth of memory, of something stubbornly human still glowing faintly beneath all this cold. You look up. Lantern light dances gently across the beams overhead, and for one brief, strange moment, you can almost imagine the ship herself dreaming right alongside her crew, her creaks turned to whispers, her sway turned to something like a heartbeat. Maybe even old wood remembers, somewhere deep in its grain, the warmth of a sun it hasn't felt in years. Standing here, surrounded by sleeping men and their fragile, half-formed dreams, the cold outside feels, if only briefly, a little less cruel than before. The next day arrives under a dull, gray light, heavy clouds hiding whatever horizon might exist beyond them. The cold bites at you before your eyes have even fully adjusted. The ship groans softly underfoot, every timber stiff with frost. The smell of salted meat drifts faintly through the air, and somewhere nearby a pan clatters loudly against the galley floor. It's time for the morning meal, though calling it that feels a touch generous. You follow the sound into the galley, where a handful of men have already gathered around a small table, heads bowed low, hands cupped around dented tin plates. The food looks about as tired as they do, hardtack biscuits chipped like fragments of stone, strips of salted beef glistening faintly with oil, and a pot of thin gray stew that smells faintly of brine and old smoke. The air here feels damp and close, thick with the smell of boiled fat and wet wool. Old seafaring records confirm that crews of this era survived largely on rations designed to last for months at a time. Meat was packed tightly in barrels of salt, cured so heavily that sailors often had to soak it overnight just to make it edible again. Bread turned to something closer to stone within a matter of weeks. If a man cracked a tooth on a piece of hardtack, nobody around him showed much surprise. They simply called it ship's bread, though in practice it felt closer to a kind of punishment. You watch one sailor working his jaw slowly through a strip of tough beef. He grunts, finally manages to swallow, then laughs without much real humor behind it. Better than snow, he mutters. Another man ladles thin stew into his cup, the liquid pale and watery. You can smell the salt in it from where you're standing. A curious detail from ship life of the period reveals that some sailors softened their hardtack using rum, soaking the biscuit until it crumbled apart, then mixing it with whatever sugar or molasses happened to be available. The result turned into something close to a rough porridge, sweet and thick, a rare small comfort in the middle of all this biting cold. You can almost taste it now, sweet and slightly bitter at once, a small spreading warmth reminding you briefly what comfort actually feels like. The cook stirs his pot slowly with a worn wooden ladle, hands red and raw from the cold. He hums quietly under his breath, some old tune from a port he'll probably never see again. The melody threads gently through the clink of spoons and the constant creak of the ship. The crew eats mostly in silence, the particular kind of quiet that comes from bone-deep exhaustion rather than any real concern for manners. There's no fresh vegetables here, no fruit, no bread that still bends properly. Lips are cracked across the table. Faces have gone pale. A few show the earliest signs of scurvy, bleeding gums, sluggish movement, eyes dulled with fatigue. The sea takes its toll slowly, without any real mercy, whether anyone notices or not. Researchers have uncovered records of resourceful cooks who tried desperately to keep morale afloat with whatever strange recipes they could manage. Some mixed crushed biscuit with seawater and rendered fat to create something resembling dumplings. Others relied on powdered mustard simply to mask the taste of meat that had started to turn. It was creativity born entirely out of desperation. These men weren't trained cooks by any stretch, but they were stubborn, and out here, stubbornness went a long way. The sailor beside you holds out a plate of stew and gestures for you to sit, so you take it, feeling faint warmth seep into your fingers through the thin metal. The broth tastes mostly of salt and smoke, thin but somehow still alive. You feel it travel down your throat, warming some small piece of you the cold had otherwise forgotten about entirely. Around the table, spoons scrape steadily against plates. For a few minutes, the only real sound is eating. An argument flares briefly at the far end of the table, two men grumbling over who's entitled to the last bit of dried fruit. Voices rise sharply for a moment, though no one else bothers to step in. Hunger, it turns out, sharpens tempers faster than any amount of drink ever could. Finally, the cook slams his ladle hard against the pot, and the sudden noise echoes through the cramped galley. The argument stops instantly. The silence that follows feels heavy, but it doesn't last long. The rhythm of eating resumes, a little slower now, a little quieter. A strange detail from a 14th century travel account mentions sailors sometimes carrying small cloth pouches filled with dried herbs or citrus peel, when they were lucky enough to have any, sniffing at them during meals just to mask the smell of food that had started to spoil. You can picture a sailor lifting one of these little pouches to his nose now, pretending for just a moment that the thin stew in front of him tastes like something better. It's a small, slightly ridiculous gesture and also a deeply human one. The air thickens faintly with smoke as the last coals in the hearth burn down low. Someone coughs. Someone else lets out a loud belch, then laughs at himself, the sound rippling through the room like a small spark catching. It's a reminder, however small, that everyone here is still alive, still together, still making it through one more difficult morning. Outside, the wind picks up again, rattling steadily against the ship's sides. The men finish their meal quickly, wiping mouths on ragged sleeves. A few tuck spare crumbs away into small pouches, just in case. Others lick their fingers clean, unwilling to waste even a single grain of salt. The cook begins scrubbing out his pot with sand and seawater, still humming that same worn tune under his breath. Historians continue to debate how crews like this one managed morale on such a meager, repetitive diet. Some argue that shared meals, however plain, created a kind of ritual unity, a quiet reminder that no one aboard was facing this alone. Others suspect the sheer monotony of the food wore steadily at discipline, feeding resentment as much as it fed hunger. Both explanations probably hold some truth. The galley, in its own small way, served as the ship's heart, equal parts comfort and quiet battlefield. You linger a moment longer. The table sits mostly empty now, plates stacked neatly to one side. The smell of salted beef still clings faintly to the air. You look around at the faces of men hardened by pure necessity, eyes dulled by cold but still visibly alert underneath it all. The sea may strip away every softness a man once carried, but it never quite manages to take away the simple will to keep living. As you turn to leave, the cook pours the last of some warm water into a small cup and offers it to you without a word. His hand trembles slightly as he does. "For luck," he says simply. You take it, warmth spreading gently into your palms. The taste is plain, mostly salt and metal, but somehow it feels almost sacred anyway. On a frozen ship like this one, every scrap of warmth becomes a kind of blessing, and every meal, however poor, becomes its own small act of quiet defiance against the cold. The days that follow grow sharper still. A creeping presence works its way into every seam of the ship. The ocean itself begins to change character, the water darkening until it resembles black glass, the wind cutting now with a high, thin, whining note that seems to find its way straight through every layer of clothing. You pull your collar higher and watch loose flakes of snow drift lazily downward, settling onto the deck before melting into small beads of water. The crew moves more slowly now, boots crunching against frozen planking. They speak less, saving their breath entirely for work. The sails hang stiff, patched here and there with frost, and the ropes themselves have taken on a faint sparkle in the pale light, each line looking almost like a thread of spun crystal strung between the masts. But you already know that particular beauty hides real danger underneath it. Ice adds weight, and weight, eventually, breaks ships. Historical accounts of northern voyages describe sailors forced to climb frozen rigging with knives clenched between their teeth, hacking steadily at built-up ice before its accumulated weight could pull an entire mast down into the sea. You can almost picture it now. A man halfway up the mainmast, fingers bleeding slightly as he chips carefully at glittering frost, wind shrieking through the ropes around him while the sea below looks solid enough, almost, to walk across. A strange note preserved in an old merchant's logbook mentions one particularly brutal winter crossing during which sailors used iron mallets to knock accumulated ice free from the sails, singing loudly the entire time so they wouldn't notice their own fingers slowly going numb. Their laughter, the account claims, froze in the air before it even had time to properly fade. You can imagine that sound now, brittle and strangely bright, carried off by the wind like tiny scattered shards of glass. The crew on the ship isn't far removed from that same fate. They move across the deck in a grim, steady rhythm, breaking ice free from the ropes, scraping frozen planking with worn wooden mallets. One man leans in close against the mast, breathing hard, beard stiff with frost. He wipes it clear, but the ice crystals return within moments regardless. Sea spray bursts upward in places and freezes midair, coating everything nearby in a thin, brittle white shell. Modern researchers have long debated whether crews of this era truly dared to sail this far north at all. Some argue that only the most desperate or genuinely lost ships would ever risk waters like these, while others believe the pull of undefended trade routes and unguarded cargo drew men steadily toward the very edge of the known world. Whatever the real reason, courage or something closer to madness, it brought them into places where even the sea itself seemed to turn hostile. You grip the railing and look out. The ocean stretches flat and endless, a mirror of dull gray. Pieces of drift ice slide past, knocking gently against the hull with a hollow, ringing sound that carries oddly far in the still air. Somewhere in the distance you hear a low cracking noise, deep and drawn out, almost like a sigh rising from the sea floor itself. The ice is shifting. The crew hears it too. Their eyes flick toward the sound immediately, wary, because they already know exactly what it might mean. If the ship becomes properly trapped, the slow pressure of shifting ice could crush the hull within minutes. No storm, no cannon fire, nothing compares to that particular kind of quiet, invisible death. A curious detail from an old sea chronicle describes sailors who learned to listen carefully for what they called the song of the ice. If you heard a high, thin whistling tone drifting through the night air, it was said the ice itself was moving toward you. The sound meant real danger, but it also carried a strange kind of beauty. Some men described it as the sea singing quietly in its sleep. You listen now, and for just a moment you think you can hear it too, a faint melodic hum threading somewhere beneath the wind. The crew keeps working steadily. One man climbs into the rigging, swinging a small hand axe. Another drags a barrel across the deck to help brace a weak spot in the hull. Their faces have gone red raw from the cold, eyes watering steadily. Nobody speaks. The steady sound of cracking wood and striking tools fills the air instead, feeling almost ceremonial in its grim necessity. Your own breath fogs thickly as you exhale. Frost has started forming along your eyelashes, blurring the world into soft light and shadow. You wipe it clear and catch sight of the helmsman, hands clenched hard around the wheel, gloves stiff, knuckles pale beneath the leather. Every movement he makes is careful and deliberate. Even the smallest mistake here could send the entire ship sliding into a drifting ice flow. The lanterns burn low now, their light dimmed further by a thin layer of frost forming on the glass. The deck glitters faintly, a frozen mosaic of salt and fresh snow. Somewhere nearby, you hear someone whispering a prayer, though the words themselves stay too quiet to make out clearly. It sounds old, possibly older than the ship itself. Records from a Danish voyage of the period describe crews using oil-soaked rags to keep their ropes flexible during the worst freezes. Sailors on ships like this one likely borrowed the same trick, rubbing lines with whatever grease they'd managed to steal from whalers or passing merchant vessels. It must have smelled genuinely terrible, but it kept the ship functional. Even now, one man kneels near the bow, working a thick black paste into a length of rope, hands shaking slightly but steady enough to keep at it. The sky darkens quickly, clouds sinking low until they seem to touch the horizon directly. Snow begins falling again, heavier this time, thick flakes swirling hard in the wind until the whole world fades into a soft, featureless white. Sea and sky blur together completely, leaving no real sense of direction at all. The crew pauses, staring out into that blankness. You can feel their unease settle over the deck like a physical weight. Out here, the line separating water from air has simply disappeared. One man laughs quietly to himself, maybe just to break the mounting tension. "The sea's gone blind," he says. Nobody answers him. The silence that follows feels heavier somehow than the cold itself. You stand still, letting snowflakes settle slowly onto your shoulders. The cold presses close around you, but the air carries a strange kind of peace within it. You could almost believe, standing here, that the whole world has simply stopped moving. The sound of waves has vanished now, replaced by the faint crackle of fresh ice forming along the hull. One by one, the crew retreats below deck, leaving you alone with the whispering snow. For just a moment you feel exactly as they must feel most nights, small, fragile, entirely at the mercy of a frozen world that owes you nothing. The ship remains alive beneath you, though, groaning softly as it pushes forward through water that has begun turning slowly to glass. Somewhere ahead, the horizon waits patiently, hidden beneath layers of mist and drifting ice. And standing here now, you finally understand exactly why sailors of this era feared these northern routes more than they ever feared cannon fire. By the following night, the ship has gone eerily quiet. The wind has softened considerably, but the cold feels sharper than ever, cutting cleanly through fabric and straight down into bone. The sea has gone calm, too calm, small, slow waves barely disturbing the surface, as though the ocean itself has frozen somewhere mid-breath. You move carefully along the deck, hearing nothing but the steady creak of timber underfoot and the faint rattle of a loose chain somewhere nearby. Below deck, the stillness feels even heavier. Lanterns burn low, flames thin and trembling weakly. The air carries a sour, unpleasant tang that unsettles your stomach slightly, the unmistakable smell of sickness mixing with damp wood and salt. A man coughs somewhere in the shadows, the sound thick and wet. Another groans softly, rolling over in his hammock. The rest try to sleep through it regardless, though their eyes stay half open, dull and visibly weary. Old maritime journals from the period describe illness as the true predator of long sea voyages, and cold weather only made things worse. Frostbite, scurvy, and fever stalked the lower decks with a kind of ruthlessness no enemy ship could match. Once infection took hold in cramped quarters like these, it spread fast, a single cough sometimes traveling through a crew faster than any cannonball ever could. You kneel beside one of the sicker men. His lips are cracked, skin pale beneath a thin sheen of sweat. He stares up at the ceiling, murmuring some prayer you can't quite make out. His fingers twitch faintly, as though still gripping a rope that isn't actually there anymore. The air around him feels slightly warmer than the rest of the room, heavy with the particular heat of fever. A curious practice mentioned in one physician's account of the era describes sailors rubbing vinegar across their hands and faces, believing its sharp sourness might kill whatever invisible sickness rode the air between them. The men here may have tried something similar, though the smell of decay lingering nearby suggests it did little real good. The vinegar burned going on, but it offered the illusion of control, and illusions out here were sometimes all a man had left to hold on to. You move deeper into the shadows. A bucket sits near the bulkhead, half full of murky water, someone having been sick into it recently. A rat darts quickly across the floor, fur sleek, eyes bright in the low light. The crew mostly ignores it. Rats have become a strange kind of companion down here, both pest and unlikely early warning system. Their sudden absence or panic sometimes the first real sign that something aboard has started to rot. Historians studying crews of this era note that men living outside naval discipline often suffered the very same plagues as the fleets they sometimes preyed upon. Lack of fresh food invited scurvy. Persistent damp invited frostbite. Minor wounds, left untreated, could easily turn into death sentences. And yet, despite all this quiet misery, crews rarely complained openly. Showing weakness at sea risked far worse consequences than the illness itself. You glance toward a corner where one man sits fully awake, sharpening a blade in slow, deliberate strokes. His eyes look distant, fixed on nothing in particular. Perhaps the motion comforts him. Perhaps it's simply fear given something to do. The scrape of metal against stone fills the silence like a kind of heartbeat. He pauses only to take a slow pull from a flask before continuing. Nearby, the sick man watches the motion as though half hypnotized by it. A quiet rumor moves through the crew that fever has already claimed 2 men this week. One was slipped over the side without much ceremony, wrapped simply in old canvas. They say his body had frozen solid before it even fully sank beneath the surface. The others lie below now, too weak to move much on their own. The healthier men step carefully around them, pretending, as best they can, not to notice. In cold this deep, grief doesn't have much energy left to spend. Researchers still debate whether crews like this one practiced anything resembling real quarantine. Some records suggest the sick were simply pushed toward the edges of the hold and mostly left alone. Others describe a rougher kind of compassion, men sharing rations, covering a sick companion with an extra blanket when they could spare one. The truth probably depended entirely on the specific crew, and on exactly how close death already felt on any given night. You feel a slight shiver pass through the floorboards as a wave nudges gently against the hull. The lantern sways, throwing brief shadows across rows of sleeping men. Their faces flicker uncertainly between peace and something closer to pain. One mutters weakly for water. Another calls out for a mother long since gone. You realize, standing here, that this particular darkness holds more than simple night. It holds every private fear that surfaces once real warmth finally runs out. An entry survives from a 15th century sailor's journal describing this exact kind of hush, calling it the silence before the sea takes what's owed her. The writer claimed the crew stopped singing entirely during nights like this, stopped even arguing, stopped almost everything except breathing, slow and careful, as though any unnecessary noise alone might invite further disaster. That same silence presses against you now, heavy enough that it feels almost physical. The ship sways again, and somewhere above, a lone gull cries out, a distant, lonely sound that fades quickly, swallowed by the ongoing creak of the hull. You find yourself thinking about how fragile this whole floating world really is, just a few inches of aging timber separating warm blood from freezing water below. The men resting here cling to that thin barrier as though sheer faith alone might keep it from ever splintering. You take a slow breath, though the air tastes stale and thin. The cold works its way into your lungs, sharp enough to remind you exactly how narrow the line between breathing freely and choking can become out here. You glance once more at the sick men nearby. One has gone completely silent now. A companion checks gently with 2 fingers pressed against his neck, then quietly draws a scrap of cloth up over his face. Nobody speaks. The quiet work of simply surviving continues on regardless. Above, the ship rolls onward, entirely indifferent to whatever loss has just occurred below. The cold shows no pity, and the sea, as always, does not pause for anyone. And yet somehow in this dim, stifling air, you can still feel the faint heartbeat of ordinary human kindness continuing on. Each cough, each shallow breath, each small act of quiet care holding back the dark just a little longer. Morning returns eventually with a pale sky and an uneasy kind of silence. The ship drifts slowly through gray water, heavy and slow. You step carefully along the deck, boots crunching over a thin crust of fresh frost. The cold bites at your fingers even through gloves. Most of the crew is already awake, moving stiffly, speaking only in low, careful voices. The sickness still lingers somewhere below deck, but life, as it always seems to, continues on above it regardless. A small sound catches your attention, a faint, delicate meow drifting across the deck. You turn and spot a small, wiry cat picking its way along the railing, fur-mottled gray tail flicking lazily with each careful step. The sight feels strangely out of place among all this worn rope and frozen boots, and yet it moves with the calm, unbothered confidence of something that has always belonged here. One sailor kneels and offers it a small scrap of dried fish. The cat sniffs cautiously, then accepts, purring faintly in the cold air. It might surprise you to learn that cats were considered essential crew aboard many ships of this era, long before later legend made them famous aboard pirate vessels specifically. Maritime records describe them as valued guardians against rats that could otherwise chew through both food stores and critical rigging. Beyond their practical use, they seem to lift spirits too, in whatever small way a warm, purring creature can manage during the darkest stretches of a long winter crossing. You watch the small cat wind between the men's legs, brushing against worn boots. A sailor with frost caught in his beard reaches down and lets it climb up onto his shoulder. The others manage a tired grin, the moment softening the hard lines etched into their faces. The cat curls there contentedly, tail wrapped loosely around his neck like a small, living scarf, a strange little comfort in an otherwise vast and merciless cold. A curious story preserved in one sailor's letter from the 16th century claims that ship's cats were sometimes believed to hold sway over the wind itself. If a cat sneezed, sailors said, a storm was surely coming. If it washed carefully behind its ears, fair breeze would follow soon after. Crews of the period treated these animals with genuine respect, and harming one, by most accounts, was thought to bring serious misfortune down on the entire voyage. You can imagine that superstition settling deep into the men's bones, part belief, part simple insurance against a world that offered them so little real certainty. The cat eventually leaps down and prowls toward a coil of rope, sniffing carefully before curling itself into a small, near-perfect circle. Its quiet purring fills the stillness around it. You realize that even a sound this small can make the whole ship feel a little less empty than it did a moment ago. But the cat isn't the only quiet sign of humanity tucked away aboard this ship. Between coils of rope and barrels of salted food, you notice other small, deliberate touches: a scrap of cloth stitched with a crude flower pattern, a rough wooden carving shaped like a woman's face, a single seashell tied carefully to a nail near someone's hammock. These small things mean more here than any amount of gold ever could. Each one is a quiet reminder of solid land, of warmth left behind, of something still worth eventually returning to. One sailor sits near the mast, sharpening his knife with slow, careful strokes. Around his neck hangs a small charm made from a fragment of colored glass, catching what little sunlight manages to break through the clouds and scattering it faintly across his hands. He notices you watching and shrugs slightly. Keeps the cold away, he says, with the ghost of a smile. The charm itself probably holds no real heat, but it holds something like faith, and out here, that turns out to be enough most days. The wind shifts slightly, carrying the mingled smell of salt and tar across the deck. The crew moves through their tasks with quiet, practiced precision, some patching torn sail, others scraping frost carefully from the planking. The cat follows along from task to task, almost as if quietly overseeing the whole operation. Occasionally, someone pauses just long enough to scratch its back, earning a soft, grateful purr in response. The sound feels almost like laughter in a place where real laughter has grown genuinely scarce. An old chronicler's account describes how sailors of this era believed animals could sense approaching danger well before any human aboard noticed anything wrong. Cats, dogs, even birds were watched closely for any small sign of unease. If a cat suddenly flattened its ears or hissed at seemingly nothing, the crew took it as a serious warning worth heeding. Watching this small creature move now, alert and purposeful, you start to understand exactly why that belief took hold so easily. One of the younger sailors kneels beside the cat, whispering something too quiet for you to catch. His tone stays gentle throughout. He scratches carefully behind its ears, then slips it a small piece of dried meat from somewhere inside his coat. For just a moment his whole face relaxes, the ghost of a boyish smile breaking through the exhaustion. The cold, the sickness, the endless gray sea, all of it seems to fade a little in that brief, quiet exchange. Even modern historians studying these voyages acknowledge that small companionship like this played a real role in helping crews survive such extended isolation. Without proper warmth or comfort, men could lose their grip on sanity almost as easily as they lost fingers to frostbite. Shared jokes, small private rituals, and yes, even a stray cat became anchors that helped keep a crew tethered to something resembling ordinary sanity. You notice other small traces of quiet care scattered around the deck. Someone has mended a torn blanket with surprising precision, using thread dyed a deep red. Another sailor has carved a set of initials into the mast, perhaps his own, perhaps someone else's, someone he left behind on some distant shore. These small fragments of gentleness feel fragile against everything else happening aboard this ship, but they're stubborn too, refusing to disappear no matter how fierce the sea outside continues to get. The cat stretches lazily, yawns, then climbs up onto a beam where it can watch the working crew from above. Its tail sways slowly as it settles into a thin patch of weak sunlight. The sailors glance up at it now and then, almost as if its calm alone might prove contagious. Even the sick men resting below might sleep a little easier tonight, knowing this small, steady presence is still there, watching. You take one last look at the small animal before turning back toward the horizon. The wind has shifted again, colder now, carrying a thin mist across the deck. The cat lifts its head briefly, then settles back down, entirely unbothered by any of it. There's something quietly reassuring in that. If a creature this small can find some measure of peace out here, perhaps, in their own way, so can the men. You push open the door to the captain's quarters, half expecting some hint of warmth or grandeur behind it. Instead, you're met with another pocket of cold air, tinged faintly with lamp oil and damp wood. The cabin itself is small, closer to a narrow box than any proper room, a single lantern hanging from a beam that groans faintly every time the ship shifts beneath it. Weak light spills across a cluttered desk, charts, scraps of parchment, and a cracked compass resting near the edge. The captain sits hunched over that desk, coat heavy across his shoulders, posture curved like a man carrying far more than the simple weight of frost. His hands look rough and deeply scarred, resting beside an open logbook. You can't quite make out what he's writing, but you can hear the soft, steady scratch of a quill moving across paper, oddly calming in its own quiet way. Captains of this era carried the illusion of privilege, certainly, but in practice their quarters offered little beyond simple privacy. Historical logs from similar 14th century voyages describe cabins exactly like this one, cramped, drafty, filled constantly with the low groan of shifting timber. A captain slept alone, yes, but never truly escaped the sea's reach. Cold slipped in through every available crack, and the noise never fully stopped, not even here. You take a step closer. Lantern light catches his face properly now. He looks older than he likely is, eyes sunk deep beneath dark shadows. A thin line of frost glints faintly in his beard where his own breath has frozen overnight. He glances up briefly, nods once in acknowledgement, then returns to his writing. His expression isn't unkind exactly, just deeply tired, the particular bone-deep exhaustion that seems to belong only to men who have led others through storm after storm. On the table beside him sits a half-empty bottle and a single pewter cup. The faint smell of drink lingers in the air. Next to it rests a pistol, polished but visibly worn, and a folded handkerchief embroidered with initials now faded almost past recognition. You sense, somehow, that the handkerchief belonged to someone else entirely, someone left behind a long time ago. A curious entry from a captured sailor's journal describes how captains of this period often wrote late into the night simply to settle their own thoughts. Some kept careful ledgers tracking loot and supplies. Others recorded dreams, private regrets, half-formed prayers. A few, it said, wrote letters they never actually intended to send. It was, in many ways, their only real outlet for honesty, surrounded as they were by men who expected nothing but bravado from them at all times. You glance toward the narrow bed pushed against the far wall. It amounts to little more than a wooden frame with a straw-stuffed mattress. The blanket looks thick but worn thin in places, patched together from mismatched scraps of fabric. A lantern hangs nearby, its glow far too weak to offer any real warmth. Even the pillow looks faintly damp with condensation. So much for any real luxury. This captain sleeps hardly any better than the crew he commands. He sighs quietly, finally setting his quill aside. His hands tremble faintly as he flexes stiff fingers against the cold. Then, as though remembering something, he reaches for a small box beside the desk. Inside sit a handful of coins, scattered bits of metal, and a single locket. He opens it briefly, revealing a small painted portrait of a woman's face, expression calm and serene. He studies it for a long moment before closing the lid gently. One sailor's testimony from the period describes how captains often kept small tokens like this one, not purely out of sentiment, but as a kind of quiet defense against guilt. Leadership at sea meant isolation in its purest, loneliest form. Every decision carried the weight of life or death, and mistakes left marks that rarely healed cleanly. The locket, the drink, the private journal, all small shields against a weight most of the crew never fully saw. The ship shifts suddenly, groaning as the hull scrapes against nearby ice. The lantern swings, throwing fresh light across the walls, revealing faint carvings etched into the wood, marks of storms survived perhaps or distant ports once visited. One shape stands out clearly, a rough cross cut deep into the grain, noticeably newer than the marks surrounding it. Maybe a memorial, maybe simply a plea. The captain's eyes flick toward it briefly before he looks away. A sudden gust rattles the small cabin window. He rises, adjusts his coat, and steps closer to look outside. His own reflection stares back at him through the frosted glass, looking almost like a ghost trapped just behind the ice. The sea beyond is dark, snowflakes clinging faintly to the edges of the window frame. He exhales slowly, fogging the glass, then wipes it clear with his sleeve, an automatic motion, oddly tender in its familiarity. Modern historians continue to debate exactly how captains of this era balanced necessary authority with basic humanity aboard ships like this one. Some argue that only real cruelty could maintain order among men this hardened. Others insist that quiet compassion was the only realistic way to survive such close, unforgiving quarters for months at a time. The truth likely shifted from captain to captain, storm to storm. This particular man seems quiet, steady enough on the surface, though the silence surrounding him carries its own distinct weight. He crosses to the bed and sits, rubbing slowly at his temples. His pistol stays within easy reach, gleaming faintly in the low light. You sense he sleeps lightly at best, if he manages real sleep at all. Perhaps every creak of the ship wakes him instantly. Perhaps he dreams of mutiny, or of the faces of men who never made it back from some earlier raid. One old chronicle records a captured sailor's observation that a captain's sleep is a coin flipped nightly by the sea herself. On a calm night, he might actually rest. On a rough one, he lies awake instead, listening to water whispering endlessly around the hull, counting every sound that might signal real danger. You imagine that exact tension now, the steady rhythm of the sea outside mixing with some quieter, more private unease within. He finally stretches out across the narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket around himself. The lantern's glow softens further, and the whole small room seems to shrink inward around him. His breathing slows gradually, though his eyes stay open a moment longer than you'd expect. Outside, the wind hums low against the glass. You linger a moment in the doorway, watching him finally settle. There's no real grandeur here, no romantic notion of command, only a man carrying far too much silence for one small cabin to hold. He closes his eyes at last, and the lantern flickers once before steadying completely. The ship creaks softly around him, almost like an old lullaby. For all the chaos happening above deck, this small cabin holds its own fragile, private kind of calm. The captain sleeps alone tonight, though not particularly peacefully. The cold keeps its own quiet watch alongside him, whispering steadily through every crack in the wall, reminding him gently of everything he's gained across this voyage, and everything along the way he's already lost. Night falls again, thick and unusually still. Lanterns on deck burn low, their light rippling faintly across wet timber like trembling reflections of distant stars. You move slowly through the narrow corridor toward the crew's quarters. The air here feels heavier than before, charged with something unspoken hanging just beneath the surface. Down here, sleep no longer comes easily to anyone. The cold has worked its way into more than just their bones. It's crept into their tempers too. The men lie scattered in their hammocks, faces half hidden in dim light. A few whisper back and forth in low, hurried tones. Others simply stare upward at the beams overhead, eyes wide open despite the hour. The ship groans quietly beneath everything, a sound that could almost be mistaken for breathing. Somewhere nearby, a bottle rolls loose and clinks softly against wood. Someone curses under their breath. Old ship's logs from this period confirm that tension built steadily on long voyages like this one. Hunger, frost, exhaustion, and constant low-grade fear accumulated slowly until they finally broke through. Crews without formal naval discipline had little structure to fall back on, but they understood resentment perfectly well regardless. When both warmth and food ran thin enough, ordinary words started turning into weapons. You move closer to one small cluster of hammocks where three men speak in low, clipped tones, voices thick with both drink and resentment. "He keeps the good rations for himself," one mutters. "The captain eats decent bread while the rest of us chew salt." Another grumbles something about the sick being pushed toward the rail a little too eagerly. Their words drift through the cold air like smoke, quiet but unmistakably corrosive. A small detail preserved in an intercepted letter from a crew member of the period mentions that captains often kept weapons within reach at night, not primarily out of fear of battle, but out of a very real fear of mutiny in the dark. Men driven by hunger and relentless cold could forget loyalty astonishingly fast. Looking at these tired, hardened faces now, you find yourself wondering which of them are still genuinely loyal, and which have already started quietly weighing their other options. A sudden thud breaks the murmuring as a man drops down hard from his hammock. He sways slightly before finding his footing, eyes glinting faintly in the low light. "Keep your mouth shut," he growls at no one in particular. Nobody answers him directly. The tension in the room thickens noticeably, settling over your skin almost like a second layer of frost. Modern scholars studying maritime unrest still debate what truly drove crews toward outright mutiny during this era. Some point to simple greed over loot. Others argue that despair proved the far more dangerous motivator. Out here in the biting cold of an endless winter night, despair certainly seems the more immediate threat. Greed requires planning and patience. Despair requires only silence, and silence is something this crew has in ready supply. The standing sailor eventually moves off, boots heavy against the boards. The others watch him go without a word. Then one of them mutters quietly, "He'll snap soon enough." A short, humorless laugh passes between them. You realize, watching this exchange, that they've all started quietly fearing each other now. Sleep has shifted from simple refuge into something closer to genuine risk. The lantern flickers, sending shadows lurching unevenly across the walls. The ship sways gently, though the mood inside stays taut and brittle regardless. Even the small cat, curled tightly in a corner nearby, keeps its eyes open, ears twitching at every small sound. The men attempt to settle again, pulling blankets tighter, turning their backs deliberately toward one another. A curious detail from a 15th century trial record describes a mutiny that reportedly began over nothing more than a single stolen blanket. One man took another's during a particularly brutal freezing night. By morning, there was blood on the deck. The court at the time called it madness brought on by cold. Reading that account now, it's easy enough to understand exactly how nights like this one could end the very same way. You glance toward one sailor seated near the door, a knife resting near his hand, not drawn exactly but clearly ready. His fingers rest lightly against the hilt even as his eyes slowly drift closed. Around him, others shift uneasily, pretending not to notice. Trust tonight has frozen over just as thoroughly as the sea outside. The smell of sweat and old smoke thickens the air further. Someone mutters a quiet prayer in a language you don't recognize. Another spits into the far corner. The low hum of the ship suddenly feels far too loud, every creak, every muttered accusation landing with unusual weight. You realize just how fragile this particular piece really is tonight. An account survives from a monk who once sailed alongside a privateering crew, claiming the sea herself serves as the truest judge, listening carefully before she ever chooses to punish. He wrote that after surviving one especially brutal midwinter night when his own crewmates turned briefly against each other, the survivors swore afterward they'd heard something like laughter carried in the waves. True or not, the story clings to the air here now like drifting salt mist. You take a slow breath. The lantern sputters weakly. Somewhere above, the wind rises again, rattling the rigging just enough to break the tension slightly, drawing every eye upward at once. The cold is returning, seeping steadily back through the timber. Perhaps that alone is enough to remind everyone here that the real enemy tonight still waits outside these walls, not among themselves. A voice finally speaks from the far corner, calm but firm enough to cut through the murmuring. "Sleep while you still can," he says. "Morning will judge whatever we've said tonight." The others fall silent. Nobody argues the point. The ship creaks once more, a sound almost like an old, tired sigh. Gradually, the whispers fade out entirely. One by one, the men drift toward an uneasy kind of rest. The knife stays close. So does the mistrust. Above them, the sea continues its low groan, moving beneath a sky too heavy tonight to show any stars at all. You watch the shadows breathe slowly in and out, understanding now that peace down here only ever lasts exactly as long as the cold allows it to. Morning arrives with a dim, bluish light seeping through every crack in the timber. Frost still clings stubbornly to the ropes, glittering faintly in the weak dawn, but the air itself feels strangely still. You step out onto the deck, your breath clouding thickly in front of you. The sea has gone quiet again, a pale mirror stretching out toward the horizon. The crew moves like ghosts across the planking, silent and slow, faces drawn tight with fatigue. The cold has settled deep into their bones by now, but they've each found their own strange, quiet ways of pushing back against it. You notice they've begun working in pairs, small clusters really, close together, sharing whatever little warmth they can manage between them. One man tightens a length of rigging while another stands shoulder to shoulder beside him, their movements almost perfectly synchronized. Nobody speaks. And yet there's a clear rhythm running through their silence, a small, stubborn kind of defiance aimed squarely at the cold. Records from a northern trading ship of the 14th century mention crews often sleeping in tight clusters during the harshest nights, pressed close together beneath shared blankets. This wasn't sentiment so much as plain survival logic. The human body simply produces more reliable heat than any lantern or brazier ever could. The crew aboard this ship seems to have arrived at exactly the same conclusion. You watch two men leaning together against the mast, wrapped in a single tattered cloak between them. Their eyes stay closed, breathing slow and even, bodies swaying gently in time with the ship's own motion. Nearby, a smaller group sits together on the deck, passing a flask back and forth, shoulders touching lightly. The cold is still very much present, sharp and unrelenting, but they've clearly learned how to soften its edges through simple closeness. A curious entry from a 15th century sailor's diary describes a practice sometimes called back sleeping. Two men would lie facing opposite directions, backs pressed firmly together, sharing warmth through the long night. It was considered purely practical at the time, nothing more. And yet, in conditions this harsh, even a gesture this small carried real meaning. You can picture it clearly now, tired faces, half-closed eyes, quiet gratitude passing silently between them through shared warmth alone. The ship rolls slightly, and one of the men laughs quietly, the first real sound of anything like joy you've heard in hours. He reaches out to steady his companion, and for one brief moment the whole atmosphere feels a little lighter. Even in the coldest, most unforgiving corners of the world, it seems, companionship always finds some way through. Experts continue to debate how much genuine cooperation typically existed among crews like this one compared to more disciplined naval fleets. Some suggest that the general lack of rigid hierarchy actually forced men to depend on each other more deeply than formal structure ever could. Others argue that constant underlying tension made true friendship nearly impossible out here. Watching this crew now, you suspect both ideas hold some real truth. The sea teaches cooperation, certainly, but it never quite lets anyone forget the danger sitting right alongside it. You walk toward the bow, where a young sailor sits cross-legged beside a small wooden box. He opens it carefully, revealing a handful of faintly glowing coals nestled inside. The heat barely reaches beyond his own hands, and yet he smiles as though it were a proper roaring fire. Two others kneel close beside him, palms extended toward the weak warmth. Their breath fogs the cold air, faces lit faintly by that small red glow. One of them hums an old, half-remembered tune under his breath. You recall reading that crews of this era sometimes passed small ember boxes exactly like this one between shifts, coals carefully banked in ash and carried hand to hand, a fragile little gift of warmth passed along the watch rotation. If the fire ever died completely, it was said to bring genuinely bad luck, as though the ship itself had lost some essential part of its own heartbeat. You can feel that same quiet reverence here now, in the careful, almost ceremonial way they handle this small box. The wind stirs again and the cold rushes back in sharply. A few men stamp their feet against the deck. Others pull scarves tighter across their faces. And yet, instead of retreating below to their hammocks, they choose to stay together instead. One wraps an arm loosely around another's shoulder. A third adjusts a shared blanket to properly cover both of them. These small, repeated gestures ripple quietly across the deck, almost like unspoken prayers offered up against the cold. The cat reappears suddenly, leaping down from a barrel and weaving easily between the sailor's legs. It purrs softly, brushing against worn boots. Someone laughs and scoops it up, tucking it carefully inside his coat. The animal wriggles once, then settles, entirely content. It's another small, shared kind of warmth, one heartbeat pressed gently against another. A curious note from a 16th-century chronicler describes how sailors of this period learned, over time, to sleep almost in rhythm with the ship itself. When the vessel rocked one direction, they'd lean instinctively into it together, conserving energy and staying warmer through shared, synchronized motion. You can see that exact rhythm now, a slow, largely unconscious dance playing out between men and sea. The captain appears briefly on deck, face pale beneath the thin morning light. He surveys the scene quietly, watching his crew huddled together in small groups. Perhaps he understands, better than most, exactly what he's looking at. Perhaps he remembers a time before command set him apart, when he too slept shoulder to shoulder with an ordinary crew like this one. He nods once, almost imperceptibly, before retreating back toward his cabin. The crew resumes their work steadily. They haul lines, scrape away fresh frost, adjust the sails as needed. Their movements remain slow, certainly, but there's a clear sense of purpose returning now, even a faint hint of renewed energy. Every small touch, every shared breath, seems to hold the cold back just a little further from total victory. It isn't fire that keeps them alive out here, not really. It's this quiet, stubborn network of shared warmth, passing steadily from one exhausted body to the next. You stand near the edge of the deck, watching your own breath swirl briefly away into the thin morning air. The horizon has softened somewhat, the sky glowing faintly pink, as though the sun itself is slowly remembering its own strength. The crew keeps working, still close together, still largely silent, still unmistakably human despite everything this voyage has already taken from them. As the wind rises again, the ship seems to groan in something like quiet approval, old timber creaking steadily beneath their combined effort. Together, this crew pushes through another difficult morning. No real warmth lasts forever out here, but for now this much is genuinely enough. The shared heat, the low, tired laughter, the steady rhythm of hands working together in unison, all of it quietly reminds you that survival, even in weather this cruel, is rarely something faced entirely alone. Night deepens once more, and with it the sea becomes a vast, dark mirror stretching endlessly in every direction. The ship drifts slowly through the darkness, heavy with fresh frost. You can hear the slow groan of old wood and the faint hiss of water sliding along the hull. The cold presses close as always, but tonight the stillness itself feels heavier than the temperature ever could. It's the particular kind of silence that seems to invite imagination, whether you want it to or not. The men speak in whispers now, words barely carrying beyond their own hammocks. Every sound seems oddly amplified down here tonight, the rattle of a loose chain, the sigh of wind slipping through some unseen gap, a cough that lingers a beat too long before fatting. Someone mutters something about the sky, about how unusually bright the stars look tonight, almost like eyes watching down from somewhere far above. The others shush him quickly. Nobody much cares for that particular kind of talk when the sea seems to be listening this closely. Old maritime folklore from the period describes how sailors often filled these long silences with stories, a way of keeping fear from growing too large in the dark. Superstition served, in its own strange way, as a kind of armor, and the long winter nights always seemed to carry more than their fair share of omens. You can almost hear those stories now, whispered in voices roughened by cold and drink, ghost ships that sailed on with no living crew at all, strange songs said to lure careless men over the rail, shadows that reportedly walked the deck the night before death eventually came calling. A curious note preserved in a medieval sea journal mentioned sailors who refused outright to whistle after sunset, believing the sound alone might summon a storm. Another old record claims that pointing directly at the moon while at sea was considered a serious invitation for bad luck. You watch one man glance upward briefly, then quickly lower his eyes again, pretending he'd never really been looking at all. The fear down here isn't loud exactly, but it runs deep, woven tightly into ordinary daily habit. The cat lifts its head from where it's curled in the captain's empty chair, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. A few of the sailors nod toward it, almost as if acknowledging some quiet, unspoken guardian. For all their hardened edges, these men cling openly to any small sign of protection they can find. A bit of faith, however small, against a world that otherwise offers them almost none. The ship creaks again, and someone whispers a quiet prayer, not directed toward any god exactly, but toward the sea itself. "Be kind tonight," he murmurs. Nobody mocks him for it. Every man aboard understands the sentiment perfectly well by now. Historians studying this era tend to focus heavily on the violence associated with crews like this one, but they rarely mention their very real, deeply held fear of the supernatural. For men living without much certainty in their daily lives, the line separating ordinary life from myth stayed remarkably thin. Many genuinely believed the sea itself carried moods, that it could come to favor or resent them depending entirely on how they behaved toward it. You can almost feel that belief pulsing quietly through the timber beneath your own feet right now. A faint light flickers suddenly outside one of the small port windows, distant but unmistakably moving. The men notice it immediately too. One sits up sharply, squinting into the dark. "Ship," he murmurs under his breath. Another shakes his head firmly. "Too small for that." The light drifts closer for a moment, then vanishes completely. A ripple of visible unease passes through the room. Someone mutters that it must have been a lantern carried by restless spirits, a sign that another soul aboard will be taken before the next proper morning. An old chronicle from Baltic sailors of the period mentions something called the dead lantern, a brief flicker of light said to appear shortly before a death at sea. Some claimed it was simply a natural electrical glow, what later sailors would call St. Elmo's fire. Others insisted it was something considerably older, a kind of messenger rising up from somewhere deep below. Modern science offers plenty of reasonable explanations involving atmospheric charge and ionized air, but standing here now, surrounded by uneasy, watchful faces, the scientific explanation somehow feels less comforting than the old legend does. One sailor rises from his hammock and spits deliberately onto the floor, a small ritual meant to ward off whatever bad luck might be circling. Another scratches a quick mark into the nearby wood with the tip of his knife. The sound of the blade is short and final. They settle back down eventually, though none of them look particularly relaxed. Their breath rises in small, steady clouds, a touch too fast for genuine calm. You look up toward the ceiling, where the lantern's flame trembles faintly with every small movement of the ship. Shadows ripple unevenly across the beams like slow-moving waves. The sailors watch those same shadows too, half expecting, it seems, for one of them to move just slightly differently than the rest. A detail preserved in one early navigator's logbook describes sailors occasionally hearing voices during the very stillest nights, faint whispers woven somehow into the ordinary sound of the wind. Some believed these were the voices of lost sailors calling out for help. Others insisted it was simply the sea itself, endlessly repeating every word ever spoken aboard her over the centuries. You pause now, listening carefully. The wind slides steadily through the cracks nearby, and for just a moment you think you can make out something softer underneath it, almost like murmured words in some unfamiliar language. The youngest sailor aboard sits up suddenly, pulling a scrap of cloth tighter around his shoulders. "Do you hear that?" he whispers. Nobody answers him directly. The others keep their eyes shut, pretending as best they can that they're already fully asleep. Pretending out here often becomes the only real defense a man has left. You glance toward the cat again. It's sitting upright now, staring fixedly at the same spot where that faint light appeared moments earlier. Its tail flicks once sharply. A small shiver passes through the room. The nearest sailor stands abruptly and throws a loose handful of salt across the floor. "For peace," he says simply. The others nod, visibly grateful for any excuse to move, to do something useful with their hands instead of just sitting with the fear. Modern scholars continue debating exactly how much sailors of this era genuinely believed in omens like these, versus how much they simply used such stories to make sense of otherwise unexplainable fear. It's easy enough to dismiss these old tales from the comfort of dry land centuries later. But down here, in a darkness that feels genuinely alive tonight, ordinary reason bends a little faster than you might expect. The lantern dims further, its flame shrinking down low. The men finally lie still again. Outside, the wind hums a single low note that seems to circle the entire ship slowly. You close your eyes and let the sound wash quietly through you. The fear in the room has softened somewhat now, steady and familiar rather than sharp, almost gentle in its own strange way, like the sea's version of a lullaby. In the quiet that follows, the ship continues drifting onward through black water. The half-told stories fade slowly into silence, though their shapes seem to linger anyway, curling faintly like smoke above the hammocks. Every sailor aboard carries some private superstition close to his chest, a small personal charm against everything unknown out here. And tonight, as the sea whispers steadily around the hull, you start to understand why certain kinds of darkness can only really be endured by giving them a proper name. The sky clears unexpectedly sometime before dawn, and with it comes a sight strange enough that the crew briefly forgets their fear altogether. You step out onto the deck and look up. The darkness overhead has softened into a deep, rich indigo, and stretched across it are wide ribbons of color, pale green shifting into gold, moving slowly like silk caught in some invisible current. The northern lights have arrived, shimmering directly above the frozen sea. The sailors stand scattered across the deck, faces all tilted upward at once. Nobody speaks at first. Even the wind seems to have gone quiet, as though the whole world has paused just to watch. The lights ripple and twist steadily, reflecting faintly off drift ice floating alongside the hull. For one long moment, the entire ship itself seems to glow softly in that borrowed color. Sailors traveling these northern waters recorded lights exactly like this one for centuries, often describing them as spirits, omens, or something like fire burning directly in the heavens. Men without any real understanding of solar wind or magnetic fields gave these lights names instead: ghost fires, dancing angels, serpents made of sky. To people who lived so entirely at the mercy of the sea, these lights were both genuinely beautiful and quietly terrifying at once. Standing here now, you can feel exactly why. The lights move with a kind of deliberate grace, almost too fluid to seem entirely natural. One sailor near you crosses himself quickly, murmuring a short prayer under his breath. Another laughs softly, clearly trying to sound unbothered, though his voice trembles slightly regardless. In the colored glow, his eyes look almost like wet stone. A curious account written by a merchant traveling these same waters in the 15th century describes sailors dropping to their knees the very first time they witnessed this phenomenon, writing afterward that the heavens themselves seemed to open and burn softly like oil spreading across still water. It must have felt, to men with no other explanation available, like either a divine message or an outright warning. Standing beneath this same cold sky now, You find you can genuinely understand both possible reactions. The lights continue shifting steadily, stretching wide across the horizon like slow, glowing rivers. The ice clinging to the rigging catches faint traces of that color too, and the frost-stiffened sails shine briefly in pale, shifting shades. The whole ship seems suspended somewhere between two entirely different worlds, one of ordinary earth and water, the other of sky and pure, unexplainable wonder. The crew begins whispering among themselves now, voices hushed as though afraid of somehow disturbing the display. Maybe it's the souls of drowned sailors, one offers quietly. Maybe it's heaven's own treasure spilling out somehow, another answers. A third simply watches in silence, breathing shallow, eyes wide with something close to genuine wonder. Historians studying maritime folklore have written extensively about how sailors of this era sought meaning in whatever they couldn't otherwise explain. For men living entirely at the mercy of the elements, the sky itself often served as both guide and god simultaneously. When it burned bright like this, unannounced, it felt very much like revelation. Some old accounts even describe hearing faint music carried along with the lights, something like distant bells or voices singing far away. You tilt your head slightly, listening carefully. The wind hums low and steady, and for one fleeting moment you think you hear something higher pitched threaded through it, lighter, almost melodic. The cat appears beside you suddenly, fur lit faintly green by the glow above, staring upward with obvious fascination, tail twitching as though the lights themselves were something worth stalking. The sight draws a quiet laugh from a few of the men nearby. For just a moment, the tension that's shadowed this ship for days seems to genuinely lift. The cold still bites at everyone's skin, but for these few minutes at least, nobody seems to feel it. A sailor at the wheel murmurs that a sky burning this bright surely means no storm will trouble them tonight. Another mutters the exact opposite, that these lights mark some kind of boundary, the edge of a world where living men were never quite meant to sail. Both versions travel quickly across the deck, blending together until nobody can say for certain anymore which one they actually believe. A scholar of old seafaring customs once suggested that belief itself was the only real protection available to sailors of this era. The lights overhead could mean blessing, or they could mean warning. Either way, they reminded ordinary men that the universe had noticed them at all, that their small, fragile lives floated within something impossibly vast and alive. Watching now, you find yourself understanding that sentiment completely, standing here on this frozen deck beneath a sky doing something no explanation could quite capture. The lights begin to fade gradually, their vivid colors softening slowly into a pale, thinning white. The men exhale together, almost as if waking gently from a shared dream. One spits quietly into the sea for luck. Another raises his flask, murmuring something about a toast owed to whatever angels might be watching tonight. The air feels lighter somehow, though colder too, and their movements slow again. As though nobody wants to leave this small pocket of wonder behind just yet, the captain steps out from his cabin, coat heavy with fresh frost. He looks up at the sky for a long moment, saying nothing at first. "Enjoy it," he finally says, voice quiet. "It won't last." There's no real fear in his tone, and no obvious wonder either, just a kind of weary acceptance. He's clearly seen enough strange sights over enough years to know that wonder like this rarely stays for long. Gradually, the glow fades from the sails entirely. The sky settles back into its familiar black, and the cold returns with its usual full strength. The sea stirs again too, small waves nudging steadily against the hull. The crew shuffles back toward their duties, quieter now, subtly changed by what they've just witnessed. You linger at the rail a while longer, unable to look away from the horizon where the last traces of color flicker faintly before finally disappearing altogether. Below deck, the men will tell stories about this particular night for years afterward. Some will insist the lights were spirits guiding them safely through dangerous ice. Others will swear they saw actual shapes hidden in the glow, faces, wings, distant burning cities. Each version will carry its own grain of truth, because what they genuinely felt tonight was real, even if the underlying cause remains, to them, a total mystery. The following days pass in relative calm, the sea settling into a steady gray rhythm, the crew slowly recovering some small measure of ordinary energy. But calm water, as any experienced sailor of this era understood, rarely lasted very long in these northern latitudes. The wind returns abruptly before the next sunrise, howling hard across the deck like something suddenly furious. You wake to the sound of canvas snapping violently overhead, the whole ship tilting sharply as fresh waves slam directly against the hull. The calm of the past several days is gone entirely. The sea has come alive again, dark and genuinely violent now. You grab for the nearest length of rope just to steady yourself, breath turning instantly white in the freezing air. The crew is already awake, shouts cutting through the rising storm as men scramble hard toward their assigned stations. Cold rain stings against exposed skin like tiny shards of glass. Sea spray bursts over the bow, freezing almost the instant it touches wood. The air itself smells sharply of iron and something close to real fear. Historical accounts from this period consistently describe winter storms as the true, final test of any crew's seamanship. In fair weather, a ship generally obeys her crew without much argument. In a proper gale, though, she seems to remember her own will entirely. You can see exactly that happening now, the deck pitched steeply to one side, loose barrels breaking free and rolling dangerously, ropes snapping like whips in the wind. The men fight hard to regain control, boots sliding on rain-slicked planking. One sailor clings tightly to the rigging, shouting orders that the wind nearly swallows whole before they reach anyone. Another struggles to haul in a frozen line, fingers raw and visibly bleeding from the effort. The sails strain so violently against the wind that you half expect to watch them tear apart completely. Every fresh gust feels almost like a living force pushing back hard against every single effort made to control it. A curious note preserved in a 16th-century logbook describes sailors referring to storms like this one as the sea's own tantrum. They genuinely believed the water itself could somehow sense fear, that the more a crew panicked outright, the harder the wind seemed to blow in response. The men aboard this ship seemed to hold roughly the same belief tonight, gritting their teeth, muttering curses and prayers together in the same breath, each trying hard to sound braver than he actually feels in the moment. Lightning flashes somewhere far off, briefly lighting the clouds in pale silver. For one split second, the entire horizon disappears completely, sea and sky merging into a single towering wall of gray. Then everything plunges back into darkness. Thunder follows a moment later, distant at first but drawing steadily closer with every passing minute. The captain emerges suddenly from his cabin, coat whipping hard in the wind, pistol still tucked securely into his belt. His eyes move quickly across the chaos unfolding around him. "Hold fast," he roars over the noise. The crew obeys instantly. Even genuine fear, it seems, cannot fully drown out discipline once survival itself is clearly on the line. He grips the wheel personally now, knuckles white against the wood, guiding the ship through wave after relentless wave. You feel the cold sink even deeper now, the rain gradually turning to sleet, each drop landing against your face like a small needle. The ropes have gone stiff and unyielding, the sails impossibly heavy with rain and ice combined. One man loses his footing and crashes hard against the mast, groaning as two others pull him quickly back to his feet. Nobody stops working, not even for a moment. Out here, pain simply doesn't get the luxury of time. A fascinating entry from an old chronicler describes sailors during northern storms sometimes coating their hands in rendered whale oil beforehand, hoping it might keep the frost from cracking their already raw skin. The smell, by every account, was genuinely vile, but it worked well enough that men kept doing it anyway. You can almost picture it now, that greasy texture mixing with salt and blood, helping some desperate sailor cling to a rope just a few minutes longer than he otherwise might have. The sea rises again, lifting the entire ship high before slamming it back down hard. The impact rattles straight through your bones. Lanterns swing violently, throwing frantic light across genuinely terrified faces. Somewhere nearby you hear a sharp burst of laughter, wild and a little unhinged. It's the particular kind of laughter that only comes from men who have fully accepted that control out here was always something of an illusion to begin with. One sailor shouts over the howling wind, "She's testing us." Another spits directly into the storm and shouts back, "Then let her test." A few others manage a weak cheer in response, their voices blending strangely with the ongoing thunder. Defiance, in moments like this, becomes its own peculiar kind of warmth when there's genuinely nothing else left to hold on to. Experts today continue to debate exactly how ships from this period managed to survive winter storms at all without any of the tools modern sailors take for granted. Some credit pure accumulated experience. Others simply credit luck. The truth is probably some mixture of both. The old wood bends without quite breaking. The ropes hold, though they creak like straining bone. The crew moves as a single unit, each small motion functioning almost like a quiet prayer that the next incoming wave won't be the one that finally ends things. You crawl toward the rail and peer down into the black water below. The waves glow faintly wherever lightning catches their edges. The sight is genuinely beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. The ocean looks endless out here, alive and hungry in some fundamental way. A strange calm settles over you unexpectedly, the particular kind of surrender that comes from suddenly understanding just how small you really are against something this vast. The storm rages on for what feels like hours. The captain stays locked at the wheel, his voice gone hoarse from constant shouting. The crew hauls lines, bales rising water, patches fresh tears in the sail wherever they appear. Time blurs together into one continuous, exhausting present. The entire world has narrowed down to just this ship, this wind, and the endless, grinding rhythm of pure survival. Then, without warning, the thunder simply stops. The wind weakens noticeably. The sea exhales, still restless but no longer genuinely furious. The battered ship drifts slowly, bruised but still upright. The crew slumps where they stand, too exhausted even to properly celebrate. One man sits heavily against the mast, head bowed, hands still shaking from the effort. Another wipes rain from his face and mutters a quiet thanks to whatever power he still believes might be listening. A single pale ray of light finally breaks through the retreating clouds. It touches the deck gently, the ropes, the bruised, exhausted faces of the crew. The sailors look up slowly, expressions mostly blank, too worn out for any real sense of relief just yet. The storm has passed, certainly, but it's clearly taken something along with it. You can feel that particular emptiness settling in now, quiet in the way that silence always feels heavier right after a great deal of shouting. You breathe deeply, the air sharp and clean in your lungs. The cold feels different now somehow, less outright cruel, more simply real. Around you, the men slowly begin moving again, checking for damage, tying off loose knots, scraping fresh ice carefully from the rails. Nobody speaks of fear tonight or of luck either. They simply return quietly to their familiar rhythm. The sea has tested them thoroughly, and for tonight at least they are all still here to see it through. Morning arrives without much color to speak of. The world outside has faded into a uniform blur of gray, the air gone still enough that it feels almost solid in your lungs. The storm has passed, but what it's left behind carries its own quieter kind of weight. You step out onto the deck, boots crunching against a fresh crust of frozen salt. The sea around the ship has slowed and thickened, dotted now with patches of drift ice floating close together like cracked pieces of glass. The sails hang limp and heavy, glazed over with frost. Every rope glitters faintly, stiff and entirely still. The crew moves carefully, footsteps cautious against the ice. Nobody speaks much this morning. The whole ship feels suspended somewhere between motion and total stillness, alive but momentarily trapped inside a world that's gone almost entirely white. One sailor leans over the rail, watching thin sheets of ice bump gently against the hull, a soft, hollow ringing sound rising up with each small collision. He pushes them away with a long wooden pole, but more drift in steadily from the surrounding water. Another man joins him, muttering something about the sea looking like a graveyard this morning. Nobody laughs. The frost, it seems, has quietly claimed everything in sight. Below deck, the air stays warmer, though thick and close. The crew huddles together in layers of wool and old canvas, some sleeping fitfully, others simply staring off into nothing. The lanterns barely hold their flame. When a man exhales, you can watch his breath drift upward like something ghostly. A few sailors chip carefully at the ice building along the rail, their movements slow but steady. One taps gently with a small hammer. Another scrapes patiently with the flat of a blade. The sound carries oddly far in the stillness, almost like working inside some vast frozen cathedral. A thin, shaky whistle starts up somewhere nearby, one man trying an old trick said to call the wind back to life. Another voice joins in, then a third, until a small, fragile chorus drifts uncertainly across the deck. The sky brightens by degrees, and eventually the faintest hint of sun appears, pale and without much real warmth behind it. Its light reflects hard off the surrounding ice, flooding the ship in a soft white glow. It's strangely beautiful, and yet there's a clear danger folded into it too. The men shield their eyes against the sudden brightness bouncing back at them from the frozen water. A sailor drops his hammer suddenly, the sound sharp enough that everyone turns at once. He stares down at his own hands, red and stiff, pale patches of frostbite spreading slowly across his fingers. Another man helps wrap the injury gently in cloth, working in silence. Nobody says much. Pain, out here, has become a private matter, something each man learns to carry quietly on his own. The ship groans again as a fresh sheet of ice slides along its side, a deep, slow sound like something ancient stirring somewhere beneath the water. You look out across a horizon that's turned entirely white, ice stretching in every direction, catching the weak light in a way that makes the whole world feel like it simply stopped breathing. But then, slowly, it begins to change. The ice groans louder, splitting apart in long, slow cracks that carry like distant thunder. The crew pauses to listen carefully. Breaking ice can mean either freedom or fresh danger, sharp edges just as capable of tearing a hull open as smooth water is of setting a ship free. They hold still, waiting to see which one it will turn out to be this time. The captain steps out onto the deck, shoulders less hunched than they've been in days. He studies the horizon a long moment, then speaks, voice low but steady. "It's moving," he says. A few of the men look up, something like real hope flickering weakly behind their tired eyes. The sun climbs a little higher, and for the first time in what feels like weeks, its light carries something faintly resembling warmth. Sheets of ice continue drifting slowly apart, the sound deep and echoing, almost musical in its own strange way. One sailor laughs quietly. Another whispers that the sea is finally letting them go. The ship pushes forward through the last scattered fragments of ice, and behind it the frozen water closes over quietly again, leaving no visible trace of the struggle. Ahead, open water waits, dark but unmistakably alive. For the first time in a long while, the air carries the faint scent of salt instead of something closer to death. The days that follow soften gradually. The ice disappears from the rigging first, then from the deck itself, thin rivulets of meltwater tracing paths through the frost. The ship smells different now too, wet wood, faint wood smoke, ordinary salt air rather than the sharp bite of true winter. The crew moves with a little more ease in their steps, shoulders loosening bit by bit as the days pass. One evening, as the sun sinks slowly toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, the men gather quietly near the bow. Someone begins humming an old tune, low and unhurried. A few others join in, voices rough but sincere. Nobody rushes the moment. The captain stands near the wheel, hands resting loosely against the wood, watching his crew with something that might, if you looked closely enough, pass for quiet contentment. The small gray cat winds between their legs one last time before curling up in a patch of fatting sunlight, entirely unbothered by everything the voyage has put them through. Somewhere in the distance, a single gull circles once and calls out before drifting off toward a horizon none of them can quite see yet. "Land soon," someone murmurs, and nobody argues the point, because right now belief itself feels like enough. The sea stays calm through the night that follows, gentle waves catching moonlight like scattered glass. The ship glides forward at an easy pace, sails full of soft, steady wind. Below deck, the hammocks sway quietly, filled again with the low, even sound of ordinary sleep, the kind that comes easily once a body finally trusts that morning will arrive without incident. You stand at the rail a while longer, watching the last of the ice fade behind them in the dark. The cold hasn't disappeared completely. It never really does out here, but it no longer feels like an enemy. It feels instead like memory, something the whole ship carries quietly now, folded into her old timbers alongside every other winter she survived before this one. The stars reflect softly on the water's calm surface, flickering gently, as if offering some small, wordless farewell. The sound of the sea deepens slightly, steady and endless, no longer threatening, just present, patient, and, in its own strange way, almost comforting. You close your eyes, let your breathing slow to match the ship's own quiet rhythm, and let the sound carry you gently under. Sleep comes easily now,